Coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Hello, athletes, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast. I am your host, as always, Mulchar. Things are a bit mad in the Nerve Centre at the moment, so I haven't got any new interview for you this week, but this is the perfect opportunity to revisit 3 of the panels from our online convention. Wow, a month ago. Seems like 5 minutes. Thank you again to everybody who supported the Galaxy's greatest 2-day online convention, where we had celebrities and creators and just celebrating 45 years of 2000 AD. If you go on to 2000ad.com/45 years, that's digits 4 and 5 years, then you'll be able to catch up on all the panels on there. But as I said last week, lots of people asked, can you put those panels on the podcast so that I can listen to them without having YouTube on? So here they are. We have the Crisis Generation panel with Garth Ennis, John McCrea, Sean Phillips, and that's hosted by Torunn Grønbekk. We have authors on 2000 AD, which is Ian Rankin, Lauren Beukes, Robin Ince, and Louie Stowell. What a lineup for that panel. And we've also got the 2000 AD Beyond Borders panel hosted by Kelly Kaneyama with Arthur Wyatt, Mike Carroll, and Chris Burnham. Now, the 3 great panels, fantastic opportunity to just plug them in your ears and listen away. So I hope you enjoy those. Earthlights. We'll be back in 2 weeks with new interviews with creators from the Galaxy's greatest comic. So until then, take care of yourselves. Don't forget to pre-order the 2000 AD sci-fi special and the battle action special, the former of which is out in July, the latter of which is out in June. We've got a bunch of signings organised. So, make sure you grab your copy of those. We shall see you in 2 weeks' time, Earthlets. And until then, Splendid Verthwig. Well, actually, Borag Thung, Earthlets. This is a little something for the YouTube channel, because obviously what's about to happen would not really work on the podcast, because you've got to be able to see it. But I'm going to give you a little preview of something very special. Brian Bolland Apex Edition, which has just come through my door and will very soon be winging its way to Earthlets all over the world. So I thought I would give you a very quick peek, exclusive to the 2000 AD YouTube channel, of this absolutely awesome book. The size of it, I mean, obviously can't really show you in the video, but it's absolutely fantastic. You know what? Let's grab a pen. So that's like a normal size pen to give you an idea of the sheer size of this book. Fantastic introduction by David Roach. And here we've got the contents scouring people's collections for pages, for covers, for just some of Brian's incredible artwork, presented as close to his original size as possible. So you get to see all the pencil marks, all the lettering, all the editorial marks, and of course Brian's signature. So we've got pages here from The Cursed Earth, a legendary cover with Jolly Green Giant. These pages, of course, never reproduced until a few years ago, with the Cursed Earth Uncensored book after a change in the UK parody laws. The Day the Law Died, well, Crime and Punishment, the beginning of The Day the Law Died epic with Judge Cal. Aaron A. Aardvark there. the Clegs. Now, I'm skipping ahead because this is the stuff I'm after. These are the Eagle Comics covers for the reprints of Classic 2000 AD for American audiences. We've also got some early stuff here. Thanos Future Shocks, Walter the Wobot, Friend of Dredd. Amazing stuff. There you go. Spinball from the Action Annual 1979. So this is just an absolutely stunning collection of original artwork. As I said, presented as close to original size as possible. Really bringing home Brian's incredible legacy as an artist on Judge Dredd. And of course, what book would be complete without Gaze into the Fist of Dread? So, as I said, this is winging its way to Earthlets over the coming weeks. Hope you enjoy Earthlets. Be sure to pre-order the Mick McMahon Judge Dredd Apex Edition, available to pre-order now from our web shop, with a special edition with slipcase and new piece of artwork by Mick McMahon. I hope you've enjoyed this little preview. Earthlets on YouTube. Be sure to spread the word. Splendid Verthrig.
Okay, guys. So we're doing this panel to celebrate the 45 years of 2000 AD. And we have our esteemed guest today, who's John McCrea, Sean Phillips, and Garth Ennis.
Hello.
And we gathered you three because the three of you, I'm not sure this is completely true, because I think at least, John, you've done something before Crisis, the magazine Crisis.
Yeah, a few things, but not much.
Yeah, and I think maybe Sean as well.
Done 8 years of comics before Crisis. Yeah.
Oh, there we are. So what I would really like for you to tell me, because I've been trying to do research on this. Crisis was a little after my time. I got them randomly at a used bookstore, where the angry guy let me buy a bunch of shit. If I can just, I made a pile of stuff and I got everything that looked interesting. So I've read a bunch of Crisis, like, and here's 45 and here's 59. So I've never read anything like in one sitting ever. And Crisis is, or was, I should say, one of the quite a few anthology magazines that you had in Britain in the 80s. So
it was all anthology magazines, pretty much in the UK. Yeah, I think that's all it was. You know, we didn't have standalone comics with one character in for 20 pages. It was always 4 or 5 pages or 2 or 3 pages split up over a bunch, you know, with a bunch of characters under a sort of a thing like a Wizard or Chips or Buster or whatever, Warlord, you know, an umbrella title.
Crisis was one of a particular group that came along in the late 80s, early 90s to take advantage of the perceived adult audience for comics, which had been discovered with the success of Dark Knight and Watchmen, and I think Mouse had all done very well in collected editions. And so it was thought that comics, anthology comics, like Crisis, could take advantage of that audience. So there was Crisis, but there was also Deadline, Revolver, Strip, Blast. I think Deadline lasted the longest, actually. And of course, the Judge Dredd magazine started around that time, but it was a little different because it employed an existing character. These other ones were all going after a slightly older audience.
So, Sean, you did comics for 8 years before Crisis.
I did, yeah.
So what kind of comics? Was that 2000 AD?
No. I didn't get into 2000 AD until after I'd already been in Crisis. I used to, like John Garth says, that all British comics are anthologies, and I worked on the ones aimed at girls. Boys didn't read them. They just really didn't. The boys' comics were war and sport, and the girls' comics were about more soap opera type stuff, Victorian orphans or show jumpers or gymnasts or ballerinas, and I drew all that sort of stuff I started when I was 15 until Crisis came along 8 years later.
Brilliant training ground.
It was
fantastic.
I mean, it didn't seem like at the time, because I only really wanted to draw Spider-Man. I didn't care about girls' comics or any British comics really, and but it was brilliant training ground, because I drew real life stuff. How to draw someone sat in a chair, someone walking down the street, horses, horrible, just awful things that you would never choose to draw. But because that's the sort of stuff I do nowadays, people sat around talking. It was very good training for me.
Okay, so and John, you did something before Crisis as well?
Yeah, I did a couple of G.I. Joe stories for the UK market, which was called Action Force. I think I did a Future Shock before Crisis, I think. And also Centurions Far Extreme, which was a toy tie-in published by some company that no longer exists, shock horror. So yeah, just a smattering of stuff, not like Sean's 8 years of, at 15.
It was,
I could draw the curtains.
That 8 years was, I was at school then and at art college, so it was only like the Saturday job. It wasn't like the real job. He kept me in records and books and stuff, so I didn't have to work in a bar or anything.
Still impressive stuff, Sean.
Thanks.
Okay, so Garth, your first published work was in Crisis?
That's right. Yeah. I'm a little bit younger than these guys, just a little bit. I actually got the job on my 9th birthday. Yeah. All right, quite a bit. I got the job on my 19th birthday, and that was in '89. And the stuff for Crisis would have been my very first. I had sent some ideas for Future Shocks to 2000 AD, but they'd been rejected because they were shite, really. So Crisis was the first real job.
So how did that come about? Because you did it with John. That was Troubled Souls, the first one.
That's right. Crisis had launched about 6 months before that, and there'd been a signing tour. And Steve McManus, the editor, Pat Mills, John Smith, and
Jim
Bakey all came to Belfast, and I met them there. And I got chatting to Steve, and I said, "Would you be interested for Crisis? Would you be interested in a story about the Troubles in Northern Ireland?" And he said, "That's exactly the kind of thing we want. That's what Crisis is for." So I wrote up an outline, sent it in, called the office on my birthday, just thought I'd take a punt on it. And to my amazement, was told that I more or less had the job.
Amazing. And then you asked John to draw it, or?
I think I'd already approached John because I knew him from the comic shop he ran. And I think I'd asked him if he would be interested in drawing it, and he agreed to, because it was set in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and this was pre-internet, so of course research was not as easy as it is now. It really had to be an artist, a local artist, and that brought it down to John and Will Simpson. And I didn't know Will, and I think he was very busy with Rogue Trooper at that point, or Dredd. But anyway, I asked John, and he did up a couple of character sketches that I sent in with the outline, and we kind of got the job together, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sean, your first thing for Crisis, that was New Statesman?
That's right, yeah. I did a couple of fill-in episodes, number 7 and 8 or something like that, maybe, because it was 14 pages every 2 weeks, and no one can do that much, apart from Carlos, who never really had a fill-in on Third World War. But, Jim was falling behind, so I got approached to see if I wanted to do a few episodes. I got the job because I had an agent at the time who got me all my Girls Comics work, and he'd heard that Crisis was coming up. This is before it even come out. Probably, I think it came out in September, so it would have been a couple of months earlier. So he showed my samples to Steve Mack or whoever was interested. And yeah, I got a bit of work out of it. I'd already approached Pat Mills a couple of years previous to that, because I went to art college in Preston, where Brian Talbot had also gone to art college a few years before me. And one of my tutors had also taught Brian and said, "Oh yeah, I know this guy that likes comics. Go around and see him." So I did. I drew a couple of Dredd pages, samples, went around to see Brian. He was drawing Nemesis at the time. He liked my stuff. He rang Pat up while I was stood there in front of him. And that was, and then Pat remembered me a couple of years later when they were looking for people for Crisis. He remembered me because of a particular awful strip I'd shown him, though. It's a one-page story for Bunty or Judy or one of those girls' comics. And it was about this girl who was always very accident-prone. And she ended up breaking her leg and breaking her arm. And her potential boyfriend that she was interested in also broke his leg and ended up with their dog breaking its leg as well. And that was what Pat remembered. A terrible drawing of a dog with its leg in plaster.
Was this sold to the Japanese market later?
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing there too.
Yeah, so I got it through my agent. Really, it wasn't. It's all his work. I don't know how he managed to convince them.
So, did the work you did in Crisis, all of you basically, did that propel you to other jobs? Was that the catalyst, or did you stay? Because I know at least Garth, you wrote a few more stories for this thing. I found out today because I as I said, I've been reading like some random Crises, and there's a story there with Charlie and a dog, and there's one panel where the dog attacks the rabbit. Do you remember this?
That's
yes,
me, right?
That is you, and I didn't know this, but I do remember thinking, because it is a horrible panel of like one rabbit just dying. There's just blood everywhere. And I was like, not the rabbits. And then the caption ends with something like, it looked like an abortion in a face cloth. And I laughed so much. Anyway, I remember this moment for like 25 years ago. And it turns out it was you, of course.
I do remember that. The artist on that, unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but I think he won a contest in Crisis or something. And the story, it's just that stupid old joke turned into a comic script. The one about the neighbor looks after the family next door's house when they go on holiday, and he sees his dog savaging their rabbit, so he buries it, and when they come home,
sews it up again and pretends
right.
It's alive. No, it died in the cage.
That's right. And then when they get home, they tell them that actually it died the day before they went on their holiday. So it's just a stupid old joke that I turned into an 8-pager. But yeah, I did a bit more work for Crisis. We all did, actually, because John, you and I did that follow-up to Troubled Souls. And Sean, you then became one of the main artists on Third World War, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. I did a few episodes of that.
Yeah.
And then me and John Smith did another thing called Straight Gate. I think started around about number 50. So, it was a good 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah.
That was our own thing.
Actually, wasn't there, speaking of John Smith, I mentioned that signing in Belfast. There was a story that John went for a bit of a walk and he ran into a British Army patrol. Do you know this one?
No, I don't know that.
And he, you probably know that John has a prosthetic arm, quite an impressive piece of kit. And is he from Yorkshire, Lancashire?
He's from Lancashire, from Blackburn.
Right. And he has quite a broad accent. So he runs into this army patrol and they're a bit, bewildered, because here's this very obviously English guy with a false arm, and he's not carrying any ID. why would he think he would need ID? You know, he didn't know anything about the security situation or anything. And
he even had any ID. He's only about 17.
Right. Right. But it's like, all right, what's your name? John Smith. And I'd love to have seen, whatever 19-year-old corporal had to call that one.
Fantastic.
Okay, so you did Straightgate, and that was, if I remember correctly here, was that one of the stories that got into a little bit of trouble with censors and stuff?
A little, yeah. We had a couple of pages pulled, but I think it was before it got as far as anybody seeing it, apart from Stephen Manus. I think he just got cold feet and decided to pull a couple of pages. But it was the words, not the pictures. It was typical John Smith stuff. He's got particular interests and he puts them in all his work. I can't really be more specific, but something quite grim, something quite misogynistic, I should imagine, because his work sometimes is. We had a couple of pages pulled, but it didn't really affect the stories, really. It was like a little sidebar, so it didn't matter, really. And we didn't know, John and I didn't know until the comic came out and the pages weren't there. No one bothered telling us.
No one asked
him to rewrite it to make it more palatable.
I think where they really ran into trouble was with the Milligan McCarthy strip.
Skin.
Which it's brilliant. It's it's one of it would have been the best strip in Crisis, really. It's about a young London skinhead with thalidomide and his vengeance upon the people who caused the whole thalidomide scandal. And I think what happened was the printers refused to touch it.
Yeah, that's right.
That caused a problem within. At the time, Crisis in 2080 were owned by Robert Maxwell's company. This is before he went swimming one dark night, and they pulled the entire story, and much the same way as Action, the whole problem over Action 10 years earlier, that created a sort of an atmosphere at the time of extreme caution. And I think I'm not sure if it was right after that or right before it that True Faith, the story I did with Warren Police, was withdrawn from sale in its collected edition because a chap called Igor Goldkind, who did PR for the company at the time, had sent copies of True Faith, which was blasphemy, really. It was the whole point of the story, to every major Christian church and group in the country. And of course, there was a tidal wave of complaint, and the book had to be withdrawn from sale. So Crisis did have its share of trouble, definitely, and it did make them a little bit cautious. And I suppose, Sean, in a way, Straightgate reaped the benefits of that in the worst possible way.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So how old were you when True Faith was kind of withdrawn from the market and everything?
20, because it had run in Crisis and then its collected edition had come out. I remember that their plan was really to just have a whole series of Crisis graphic novels for sale in the US as much as anything else, but they ended up only doing a few. They did Our Books, John, and True Faith, and a few other bits and pieces. Crisis, it had kind of run into trouble fairly early, because although the sales had been fantastic on the first issue, they'd immediately plummeted. And in fact, John and I, we got the job because they decided to cut one of the stories and they needed a replacement fast. And that's how we got in there, because it was sort of panic stations.
Not really on our own merits or anything, just because we were the best shit lying around that we could scrape up, really.
Exactly. It's like, let's hold our noses and go into the submissions pile. And it's like, what's this? And that's what we got. You see, the whole thing, just to expand on this a little bit, I mentioned the sort of wave of adult comics that had come along at the time. The trouble was that a mainstream audience will pick up The Dark Knight or Watchmen or Mao's collected editions, and they'll enjoy one story under one set of covers. But what they won't do is go to a comic store or a newsagent and pick up an anthology every week or every fortnight. And so this adult comic movement, in a way, it was biting off more than it could chew. It was based on this fallacy, really, that there was a big enough mainstream audience out there for mature comics, and there just wasn't. And that's why none of these things lasted more than a few years. I mean, I think Deadline went about 6 or 7. Crisis was gone in 3. Strip and Blast and Revolver disappeared almost straight away.
I mean, the Judge Dredd magazines lasted till now, because that's just aimed at old 2000 AD fans. Mm-hmm. It was slightly more adult than 2000 AD. So it's just people that had grown out of that and then started reading that instead.
Mm.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there's much to differentiate the two these days, really.
I don't think there's now, but I think when the magazine came out, 2000 AD was still just for kids.
Gotcha.
Really. Yeah. It's not now, is it?
No.
Yeah.
So did you all grew up reading 2000 AD?
Yep. First issue.
A little bit. I didn't read it. I wasn't really that into it. I was really only into comics. It wasn't glossy. It wasn't colourful enough and glossy enough for me. It took me until, I don't know, the first one I remember reading and thinking I'm going to carry on reading this was the Steve Dillon Dredd werewolf story.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember what that was called, but I would have been about 18 maybe then, and I hadn't really picked it up for a few years. I thought, actually, this is really good. So then I started reading it all the time, and also by then I'd gone to art college, and it was easy to get. Normal other American comics were hard to get back then, so this took their place, really.
Yeah. I remember throwing the space spinner over my hedge with my first throw from issue 1, and then putting on the Bitonic stickers or whatever the fuck they were called, and pulling them off a couple of minutes later and pulling all the hairs in my arm off with them. So yes, good memories, fun times. Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah. For me, it was pretty much 2000 AD all the way, really. And Battle and things like Commando in the picture libraries. I saw almost no American comics until I was a good deal older, with the exception of Mad magazine. Mm-hmm. First American comic I read cover to cover was Dark Knight, which is an odd way to start, I think.
Yeah, not really.
Go downhill from there, isn't it, really?
Well, I did then. I do recall thinking, my God, American comics are wonderful. I've been a fool. I must go out and buy as many as I can. And of course, a nasty surprise lay in store. But one of them was one of Alan's Swamp Things.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, right, Halo Jones, DR and Quince, this guy working in American comics, great, more of this.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have one question for you, Garth, but just because 4 people asked me this. Did you write something before? Did you write other things than comics? Did you write poetry while you were sitting in your island?
No, I did not write anything really. I mean, there were the outlines for the Future Shocks that I mentioned. I probably knocked off a couple of half-decent English essays. No, I really didn't.
Troubled Souls is your first piece of work.
But did you want to be a writer?
Yeah.
Garth, did you want to be a writer then? Or did you sort of fell into it?
I recall thinking, reading 2000 AD and Battle, and then progressing later to, things like Dark Knight and so on, and Watchmen and Swamp Thing, and the stuff that was around at the time, like Concrete and Love and Rockets and Peter Baggs' neat stuff and things like that, and thinking, yes, there really is something worthwhile going on here. It would be good to do this. This is like a really interesting time in comics, and the medium is evolving, and I'd like to be a part of that. So yeah, I did want to, when I approached Steve at the Crisis signing, it was with definite ambition to get a career going in comics.
Yeah, but you weren't like, well, I don't know about you, Sean, but I was wanting to draw comics since I was 4. When my mum and dad bought me my very first comic when I was 4, and I just went, that's what I'm going to do when I grow up. I'm going to draw comics. So I presume it was, a bit later on for you, Garth. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to sort of nail down the exact time, but sort of mid to late teens, I suppose.
Sure.
When I started to think about some sort of writing career. I mean, journalism occurred to me. That would have been a disaster. But
you wouldn't have a job now, would you?
No, good point. Very good point. But yeah, Troubled Souls was really the first thing, and that was, if I'm honest, naked ambition. Really, it was like, I want to get into this business, and this looks like the way I can do it. Because at that point, there really weren't any other comic book writers from Northern Ireland. And so it was kind of taking advantage of a local issue to get into the business.
Which is nothing wrong with that. So,
and it is a confident piece of work. Like it does. I know you're trying to hide it as well as you can. But it is interesting, and it is it's too good to be the first thing you ever wrote. It's annoyingly good to be the first thing.
Well, you're not the first to say it. I mean, I kind of cringe when I think of it, but I suppose if we go back to the guys in the Crisis office looking at the submissions pile. Maybe it was the best of a bad bunch because at least it went in a straight line. At least it behaved the way a story's supposed to. Like that basic narrative ability is something that a lot of people lack at the start. And maybe I was just a bit closer to it, closer to having it than a lot of people were at the time. I mean, as I say, I'm not fond of it, but it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't, it's coherent. It doesn't go awry, or there aren't any. I don't think there are any plot threads left untied. It covers the basics, let's say.
Yeah. I still have a fondness for it, partly, for the writing of it. I mean, the artwork, not so much myself, but again, that was your first work, and it was my first work that I painted. And I wasn't like Sean. When Sean started painting stuff for Crisis, he was a fucking great painter, whereas I had never painted in my life. So I had to learn on the job how to paint. And
we all learn on the job.
Yeah, well, we do. Yeah, I mean, we're still learning, aren't we, Sean? I mean,
I hope so. Yeah,
but I one of the things I thought I should do. Look, I have a page of Troubled Souls right here. One of the things I thought I should do was draw it big and paint it big so that I could then, when it got reduced down, and here is a copy of Crisis, and look how tiny a copy of Crisis is compared to my.
Oh, that's massive.
This is Princess Leia in her little spacecraft. And this is the fucking Star Destroyer coming out in comparison. And so, yeah, I was just flailing about as it goes and learning on the job. And, I look at it now and go, oh, Jesus, but it's interesting. I think it's an interesting sort of piece of history. One of the things that I did was go around photographing all the areas to put into it. They're all real places. And every time I went somewhere and took a photograph of it and put it into the strip, the place got blown up shortly afterwards. So I did ask you at one point to put my school into it, put old Hollywood, Sullivan into it. Yeah, I did ask you to do that just as a favour, so that it would get blown up shortly afterwards as well. That was pushing the boat out, I think, that one.
I do remember them asking you if you can handle full color artwork, if you can do fully painted, and like the actor who's asked if he can ride a horse, you just said, "Yep, no problem at all."
And just lie.
You don't say no, do you?
No. Just lie like a professional. Yes, exactly.
My first published work had horses in it, and I just said, "Yeah, I can draw horses." And that was the last time I drew horses until a couple of years ago as well.
You did 8 years of girl comics, and you only did horses once.
Yeah, first job. Yeah, I had to draw ballerinas and gymnasts and stuff. That's slightly easier than horses. Not much.
I do remember actually. I remember at one point in Preacher, there was a storyline where the lead character becomes sheriff of a little town, and I gave him a badge and a 6-gun and a little dog. And Steve Dillon said to me, "You're going to put him on a fucking horse, aren't you?" with a look in his eye that said, "Don't put him on a horse." And I didn't put him on a horse.
But then you went and wrote that Preacher special, which is all about the horses and the horse killing.
But didn't you draw that?
Well, no, Steve drew it, but Steve just basically makes ovals where the horses were, and then I drew the horses in and inked them, and Steve just left all the horse drawing to me. Right. Didn't he do that with Glyn as well? Didn't he get Glyn to draw the tanks?
Yes, the tank battle in Monument Valley. There were just spaces left, and Glyn drew in the tanks. Yeah.
Shocking. I have a page from Johnny Red.
Well,
there. Yeah. And the fun thing about this page, because I got it from Keith Burns, is that there is a Hawker Hurricane there, but it's not the one in the book, because at some point Garth went, I want to see the roundels, so can you just twist the plane a bit? Like the most horrible man in the world. Yes. And so lovely Keith obviously did. And I have the original page, and he gave me the new plane that he drew for you. So I can see why Steve would be like, I'm going to leave the tanks to someone else. Yeah. Just in case.
Yeah, that was a very Steve move. Yeah, I know the page you're talking about, and it's a great shot. It's just that it's an intro shot, so it doesn't quite work. Hence,
I got 2 hurricanes. I am happy. I'm just saying. I can't imagine anyone looking at that page and doing anything but like cry happy tears. Okay, but one of the things that is interesting to me in Crisis is both of your art styles there. It looks experimental. It looks like you're having fun and using different, like you're using photographs. Was that a thing you did back in the 80s, or was it specifically for the kind of mature comics that you were working with?
Well, I think for me, it's like John said, we learn on the job. And, painting comics take a long time, and any shortcut is welcome. So, yeah, paste in a photo, paste on a map, do whatever you can. But also, I mean, there was a massive explosion of painting comics in the UK and in the US then. Straight Toasters or Arkham Asylum or Bisley painting Slain, and all that can't help but feed in to your own stuff. You look at that and think, wow, that's great, The biggest influence I had on my stuff, The New Statesman, was I took my first few pages into the office when Fleetway were in London, and I lived in London at the time. And I put my first few pages, I was really pleased with them. I thought they were great. And I'd get there, and they've got a double-page spread that Duncan Fegredo drawn for his episode of New Statesman, which was coming out just before mine or one before. And his was like a parade with horses and like a million people, and it was just so exciting looking and so totally different to how I drew and how I thought and everything. And I just think, that made me really want to try and develop my stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, and we all hate Duncan, don't we?
Yeah.
Talented fucker. Yeah. With me, enjoying was perhaps not the word to use for when I was painting comics, more sort of like pulling teeth. It was just horrible. I hated every minute of it. Every painted page has my blood on it, really. And that's more because I was trying to commit suicide at the time. And then sort of just, Jesus. I was so happy when I got to move over to the States and start working for DC. Archie Goodwin got me over, and the very first thing they gave me was a fully painted prestige format book with James Hudnall. So I nearly drove myself off a cliff. It was just like, fuck's sake, not more painted artwork. Please leave me alone. So yeah. Thank God the demon came along shortly after that. But yeah, it was, I really didn't like the whole painted sort of, and I still don't really like painted comic artwork particularly. It doesn't really work in comics, I don't think, because it makes you stop and look at each panel and take it as a piece of artwork instead of as part of a story that's you're meant to be getting on with. And I think that doesn't really work at all. It's anyway, not for me at any rate. No.
I read
some people can do it. Sorry.
Go ahead, Sean.
No. I was going to say, I mean, modern American comics with computer coloring look more detailed and more complicated than painting artwork ever did. So
yeah.
Do you have the same problem with that?
Yeah, I don't really like most of that overly computer-colored artwork. It sort of just...
It takes you out of the story again.
Yeah. It also, it's too hyper-real. I mean, I don't read comics to look at real things. I read comics because I want to I much prefer somebody like, say, Mick McMahon, who's a complete stylist and pares his artwork down to the bare minimum or what have you, than somebody who just draws everything in the kitchen sink. That's it. That's what I'm doing at the moment. But, anyway, basically can't teach or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, I don't like the overly rendered computer coloring either. No.
I fell down a lettering page, the letters page in Crisis rabbit hole yesterday, trying to slightly prepare for this. And one of the comments they got quite often was like, oh, this is something new. This is something beyond comics because the mixing of the media and everything. And they would always be just like, no, this is comics. Just get over it. You like comics, sir. I'm sorry. That's what you like. but it was a fun time. They printed a lot of cool stuff. I think the best thing I've read was this quote: although many pagans use animal sacrifices, most have realized the long-term effects of these methods. Eventually, the novelty wears off and you end up knee-deep in blood and too little to no effect. It is...
Is that a letter into Crisis?
Yeah. I don't know.
They didn't make quite a lot of the letters up, though.
Oh, God, I hope so. But it is so worth reading. I found I have them all now, except for 45. So I don't think I've ever read the more troubles, the first part of your second Troubled Souls. I've never read them. Yeah.
And you must have read The New Adventures of Hitler. Grant Morrison and Steve Yeun. Well, yeah, that's probably my favorite out of all the stuff that saw print in Crisis, actually. Grant had, I think, been sort of slightly disparaging about Crisis when it first came out. So it was funny that this strip actually came along at a time when Crisis really did need a sales boost. And of course, Grant's name provided that. As you can imagine, with a title like The New Adventures of Hitler, it had run into problems of its own. I don't think it's ever been reprinted since, which is a shame because it's an absolute cracker. Yeah.
Did they finish it?
Yeah.
Because originally it was in a Scottish magazine, wasn't it? It was at the Cut.
Yes.
In black and white, a few episodes, and then
Grant got into it with some. Was there some lead singer of some band who also wrote a column for a style?
It was Pat Kane from Hue and Cry.
Right. Yeah. And Grant had sort of gotten into it a bit with him, and that may or may not have led to them having problems, but eventually it saw print in Crisis. And it was Steve Ewell drew it, but Steve Whitaker and Nick Abadzis collaborated on the color, and they did a really interesting job on it. You know, they were using wallpaper and stuff like that. Just having mentioned Nick Abadzis, I should say that probably the best story to come out of this entire era of adult comics was Hugo Tate by Nick Abadzis in Deadline, which was totally unlike anything else in Deadline. It was absolutely brilliant, and if you can get a copy of the collected edition, I really recommend it. It is I'd say it's one of the best comics you'll ever read. If that era gave rise to anything worthwhile, it would be Hugo Tate. That would be at the top of the list.
Yeah, and Nick having a career writing stuff. I mean, the Lacka and some of the other stuff that Nick has done. Everything Nick does is pretty brilliant, really. Yeah, man's a genius.
So how did you guys feel about Deadline?
That's where the cool kids were.
Yeah, that's very.
We were the squares.
That's totally true. In fact, that nicely sums up the problem with that particular time in comics. Crisis and Deadline both launched at the end of the 80s. I think they launched within about a week of each other.
I think I checked. It was 3 weeks apart or something.
Right. It was sort of September, October of 88. And you had Crisis, which was strident and political and committed. And you had Deadline, which was chilled out and mostly just fun, not really about anything, ideal for passing around the squat when you're smoking a joint. It had a like kind of a rock music section to it. And what you had there is you had Crisis, an 80s comic that actually actually managed to exemplify a time that was on its way out. And Deadline, a comic which nicely anticipates the coming age, the 90s. And Crisis, as a result, because strident political stories weren't really what people wanted at that point, Crisis didn't last, and Deadline lasted twice as long just because it managed to nail the zeitgeist, I suppose. Probably more by accident than design. But if you look at the two comics, that's kind of the problem right there.
What issue did Deadline get to? Because I don't remember Deadline really getting beyond about issue 60 or odds or something like that.
They lasted till 1995, so I suppose it's quite a lot.
I suppose it was monthly, wasn't it? Of course, Deadline. Monthly. Crisis was bi-weekly. Yeah, of course.
And it's gone in 91. By which point they're doing stuff like reprinting Milo Manara, and lovely as that stuff is, it doesn't really stand being reprinted in 9-page chunks. You know, it's not exactly narrative heavy.
No, and it's not really not exactly what Crisis set out to be either. I mean, it's just not Milo Manara really. No, I mean not a lot of his stuff at any rate. He's not known for his politics, not that sort of politics at any rate.
But it was enough. But did you do a lot of other things in Britain at the time? Because we were talking. But did you do other things in Britain? Because people must have been paying attention to what you were doing in Crisis. Yeah. Because you all went over to America, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, the Americans had their eye on the British industry really since the early 80s when they picked up people like Bolland and Gibbons. I can recall meeting Karen Berger at the Angoulême convention in early 1990 and handing her a copy, one of the first copies I got of the Troubled Souls collection, which turned out to be kind of a great almost portfolio of my work. It was like a great sample of what I could do. And both she and Archie Goodwin picked up on me from that. I think you guys had, followed similar paths.
Yeah, I first met Karen in '89 when she came over for UCAC, and John Smith and I went to show her this great idea we had for a Two-Face graphic novel. Arkham Asylum had just come out, was just about to come out. We had no idea who she was. All we knew was she was from DC. She hated superheroes, wasn't interested in that, and we showed her this, and she wasn't remotely interested. But a few months later, she got me in to do a couple of issues of Hellblazer. And that was early 1990, so I've been on Crisis for about 18 months by then, so it happened pretty quick. But I was also doing the girl still as well when I was doing New Statesman, because that wasn't enough work to keep me going. So that I carried on that for the next couple of years as well.
What do you think the Americans saw in British comics at the time that was so interesting? Because to me, at least, the British stuff felt like nothing else. It was a lot more political. The art was better and different and more experimental in many ways.
I think the British British as an artist just aren't that interested in superheroes particularly. And when if they do make superhero comics, they're very cynical about it. So I think that definitely helps.
Yeah, it was the broad spectrum of comics that were published in the UK that was part of that, with 2000 AD, but also all the war stuff and the humor comics as well. So you got these strange amalgams with people who could draw quite cartoony, but also realistic or what have you. People could mix it up a lot more than the Americans to a degree. Though, I mean, that's not completely true. You had Mad Magazine and guys like Wally Wood and who could draw anything and in any style as well. But I guess maybe we were just more anarchic to a degree, possibly.
Yeah, I think on the writing side of things, the US industry and DC in particular had been mining a very rich vein since they got Alan Moore. That paid off very well for them. And then you had that sort of almost immediate next generation with Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and Jamie Delano and Pete Milligan and myself. Then you eventually had myself and Mark Miller and Warren Ellis, and we were sort of the scrag end of that. But it was something that worked out very well for them, because I think we all had just a slightly different take on things. And of course, people talk about the British invasion and so on, but you cannot invade America, I've always thought, in any sense, cultural or any other way. You get it. What happens is you get absorbed. And the American writers look at this stuff and they learn the lessons, absorb them, and then you begin to get people appearing who can do as good or better. I think personally that the best writer to get into the business in the last 25 years is Brian Vaughan. And nowadays, when a really good new writer comes along, they're as likely to be from the US as the UK.
But I just find it interesting that all of the creators that had a huge impact on me when I started reading comics, and I had I enjoyed comics, and then I taught myself to read English so I could read more comics, basically. And that's when I started picking up Crisis and whatever the Vertigo stuff when that came along. And I didn't think about what was the UK stuff and what was the world, basically. But I had much the same experience as you did, Garth, when I found all the Vertigo stuff and I was like, oh, this is great. American comics, awesome. And then I started reading, I just started picking up the Marvel and DC stuff, which wasn't as good.
Right.
So I think the first Marvel comic that I truly loved was one of your Punishers. And it turns out that's not how the rest of it works. Not that I would say anything bad about Marvel, of course.
Of course. Yeah. You wouldn't want to do that. I mean, I would trace a line all the way back to the 70s, and I would look at Battle and Action and 2000 AD, which is for great British comic writing. That's where it really begins. You have Wagner and Grant and Mills and a lot of guys, but you also have Alan Moore seeing this stuff. And I believe he's on record as saying that's when he began to think that maybe he could work in this business, maybe he could work in comics, maybe there was a way to say worthwhile things with the medium. And it comes out of that stuff that Pat Mills and John Wagner kicked off in the mid-70s. You then trace the line up through the 80s as the writers sort of born of 2000 make their way to the American market. But it all begins there.
So there was a question I got for you guys, all of you. Do you think being published in Crisis at such an early stage helped you develop creatively, or was it a hindrance?
Oh, anything's a help. I mean, it's working, being paid for it, having your stuff seen, seeing how your stuff looks in print, even if you're not the happiest with it, it's a learning experience. So nothing's a hindrance from that point of view.
Mm.
Yeah. And like Garth said earlier, it was great times. Fantastic
I think all of us, it was the first time we were full-time as well.
Yeah.
You know, I'd left college 2 months before I started working on Crisis. And before then, I'd only been doing it, at the weekend. This is the first time I'd done it every day. And through the sheer volume of work that you produce, you can't help but improve and try new things. And, I think it could have been a different comic, but it happened to be Crisis. And I think it was definitely good in hindsight because it was more real life stuff and it wasn't sci-fi and it wasn't superheroes. So you got to draw more naturalistic things.
Mm. Yeah, I found it like generally, as John says, it's a help rather than a hindrance. You have to start somewhere. Maybe it led me to bite off more than I could chew. Maybe if I'd gone the more traditional route of, short stories for 2000, the Future Shocks, and then a series, and then maybe being picked up by the Americans, it might have meant that I developed a little better, a little earlier. Instead, I sort of grabbed for things in every direction. A year after I started, to my amazement, I was writing Hellblazer and Judge Dredd. Now, I wasn't very good at either of them, but the point is I had those jobs very, very early on, and it took a while. I mean, I don't think I wrote anything decent really until late 92. So I had this sort of 3 years of crap to get out of my system before I could start writing something decent.
What was the first good thing you wrote?
I think the first sort of decent thing I wrote was the first issue Steve Dillon drew as regular artist on Hellblazer. And that's a coincidence. He just happened to come on board when something went click. And I turned out something decent. It would have been around about the time I was writing The Demon as well.
Okay, we're running out of time, but I do have one. We talked about this before, Garth, but there is something. I'm not sure if political is the correct word, but there is something. It feels like the people who were making comics in the late 80s in the UK, it feels like they really wanted to tell stories somehow. It was not as bloodless as we can see in modern comics today. Do you think it was something about that era that made people want to express things in a way that we don't? I'm not sure how to. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that because I talked earlier about how Crisis caught an 80s vibe right when it needed to catch a 90s one, which Deadline did and survived longer as a result of. In the 80s, that was an intensely political time. You had Margaret Thatcher in charge of the country, and that created a great deal of division. You either thought her policies were a good idea or you didn't. There was very little middle ground. And as in most cases, artistic types will, broadly speaking, tend towards the left. And that was as true of people working in comics as it was of anything else. You had Pat Mills, who's always been an intensely political writer, going all the way back to Charlie's War and Battle. In a way, his strip for Crisis Third World War was really the culmination of something he'd been doing he'd been wanting to do for a long time. All of a sudden, he didn't have to be satirical anymore. He could take the gloves off and say exactly what was on his mind. Judge Dredd itself is, of course, a satire on a fascist system. People who came after Alan Moore, the anarchist, of course, had always been not necessarily of a similar mind, but not dissimilar. I mean, Milligan, Morrison, very obviously, Jamie Delano, very political writer. And they took that with them to the States, all of them. I suppose you could say that in that sense, as well as what John talked about, the kind of quirkiness of a lot of British writers and artists, maybe the politics is just as important as anything else.
I sometimes feel like there is more hope somehow in the 80s comics because they were angry but they felt like they could change something. But now it feels like we're just going, I don't know.
We thought we could change things. And, now we're bitter and twisted, and no, we can't.
Yeah. Pretty much.
Actually, if anyone's interested in this, on YouTube, you can find a documentary. It's about half an hour long. It's called something like The Day Comics Grew Up. I think it's an episode of a show called Signal. And it has interviews with Steve McManus and Pat Mills and Jim Bakey and John Smith and Karen Berger and Archie Goodwin. And they're all, a lot of them are talking about this period in comics, this tendency towards the adult. And of course, Steve and Pat and John and Jim are talking specifically about Crisis. And it's interesting to see them talk about it at the time in terms of what they thought they could do. I think the phrase change the world is used more than once.
Really? Oh, dear.
I wish we were at that point where we were like, oh, we can change the world instead of just TikTok going, well, we're all fucked. Okay, so we're running out of time, but would you tell us what you're working on right now?
I'm working on this.
Excellent.
A book called Reckless. This is the first volume. Number 4 comes out in a few months. The last 15, 20 years or so, I've been working exclusively with Ed Brubaker as the writer, doing creator-owned, self-made stuff. We both got disillusioned with working with Marvel and DC, and thought the only way we'd get to do what we'd like is if we came up with it ourselves. So it's taken a long time to build a market, but the people are there now. So it's sort of like that's like a private eye type thing, but we mostly do crime stories.
I thought about if I should introduce you guys and be like, yeah, this is the writer or blah, blah, blah. But I just figured that people would know at this point.
Yeah, maybe.
And I would pick really, really strange titles probably of yours, but so Garth, you're doing 2 books for Rebellion?
Let's see. I'm changing the world with Hawk the Slayer. Which I must say Henry Flint is doing a beautiful job on. I've got a new war story out at the minute called The Lion and the Eagle with PJ Holden. There'll be a Punisher book towards the end of the year with Jason Burrows. And probably the biggest thing I'm doing this year is the Battle Action Special, where I've written 7 stories and I've got 7 of the best artists I could get working on the old battle and action characters. So I've got Keith Burns, PJ Holden, Chris Burnham, John Higgins, Patrick Goddard, Mike Dory, and I'm delighted to say Kevin O'Neill. And Kevin enjoyed doing the short story with me so much that he asked about doing another one. And so I can reveal that we will be bringing back a very, very, very old 2000 AD character in this year's Christmas special or something like that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it. I'm off for a pint with Nick Abadzis, by the way, so I'll say
give him a hug. Give him a hug. I know it's not really your thing, Garth, hugging, but hug him all the same.
Hello and welcome to 2000 AD's panel, which is, as you probably know, the 45th anniversary of 2000 AD. And we're not going to waffle on about it because you know why you're here. So I'm going to tell you we're joined by Ian Rankin, Louie Stowell, and Lauren Beukes. And I can tell you that you know Ian Rankin. He's an author. You know he's created Rebus. You know he's got an incredible collection of prog rock records. And I know that House has some Edgar Allan Poe awards, I think, as well. I hope I'm right saying that. Lauren Beukes has written, again, remarkable work, short story writer, television writer, journalist, and had a story in 2000 AD's 40th anniversary issue. And Louie Stowell, I can just tell you that her latest novel is the next novel that I'm about to read. And I grabbed it off my son, who had it initially, but I decided I'm going to get through it quicker. So that new book is Loki. So hello, everyone.
Hey.
Right, hello. I'm going to start. I'll start off with you, Ian, because I think you probably, being even older than me on the panel, you were around when 2000 AD actually started, when it was first in the newsagents. When did you know about its existence?
Very early on. There weren't any bookshops in my village, but there was a newsagents, and I used to buy every comic going, starting off when I was very young with a Bimbo and stuff like that, and moving on to the Victor and the Hotspur, all the great DC Thompson titles, and then moving on to the Marvels and the DC comics. Irregularly, because you couldn't always, you might get one issue and then you'd go in the next week or next month and you couldn't find the one that came after it. So I had a lot of very incomplete stories and I had to fill in the gaps myself using my imagination. 2000 AD, I don't think I was around for issue 1. I don't know why I wasn't around for issue 1, but I certainly picked up on it pretty early on. It would be one of these things where you're in the playground. I was about 17 when it started. In the playground, somebody would have a copy, you'd borrow it from them, you'd read it, you'd say that is great. The next week you go and buy it.
Because I think the nearest, because I would have been 8 when it came out. And I think just before that Action comic, which was quite, that was beginning to move towards it. It was a big move away from Victor. It had kind of, Jaws rip-offs. And I think probably got letters of complaint from various, readers and listeners, kind of associations, because it was quite gory. Louie, what about for you? When was 2000 AD something that you noticed on the shelves?
So I didn't notice it on the shelves first. I noticed it in my house because my dad had a massive stack of them. So I think it would have been the mid-80s. I was about 6 or 7, I think, and I started diving into them. And around that time, also Richmond's first comic book shop opened up as well. And I remember going to visit there. It was called They Walk Among Us, sadly defunct, but it was great. And I think it was the Dark Judge's story was the first one I ever read. That whole arc, and it just really sucked me in. And I think it was nothing like, I read the Beano and all that. I also read Oink. Anyone remember Oink?
Yeah.
But I think 2000 AD, it had that combination of everything being hilarious, it also being quite satirical, which I really liked. I was quite a weird kid. And also the gore and the action. I loved Slain when they did the Blood Eagle and you got the ribs ripped apart. And I now write children's books and I still feel really cross that I'm not allowed to put that sort of thing in children's books because I read it when I was 6 and it was fine.
It's an interesting thing, Lauren. I don't know for you, whether when you start reading something like 2000 AD, for me, it felt like you were suddenly a bit more grown up. It felt like not only was the art also, I think that's a very important thing the art, if you look at the standards of a lot of art that was in comics, and especially the terrible annuals that used to come out and have very cheap art in it, this felt like, I'm pretty mature 8-year-old now. I'm kind of going in the darker and stranger dystopian visions.
Absolutely. So, I was in South Africa where I grew up and we were under sanctions, which meant that we very rarely got comics, as Ian experienced, you wouldn't get comics regularly. So you wouldn't get every issue. So 2000 AD monthly for me was an absolute godsend, because here's the entire story from Bad Company to Slain to Nemesis the Warlock, Halo Jones, Strontium Dog, and to be able to get the full story without missing like 12 issues and then trying to make up what happened in between was absolutely amazing. And I also felt that it was very much, it was a very political comic in a way that, the occasional issues of Amethyst or Spider-Woman or, Batman that I was able to get hold of intermittently were not. 2000 AD dealt with a dystopian society. It dealt with totalitarianism. The Strontium Dog stories were such a great analog for what was happening under apartheid. And it really felt that this was something urgent and relevant. And certainly resonant with kind of what my life experience was and hella punk. And I did feel more grown up, definitely.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, as you said, I think the best science fiction is always looking at, well, in fact, as you were saying, Louie, about being interested in satire, there's a tremendous amount of satire in the best science fiction. There's a tremendous amount of reflecting on the world that you are in at any one time. And it feels to me that 2000 AD was a lesson for a lot of the great big comic book companies at the time. It seemed like quite a kind of, cheap, inky thing compared to, these wonderful, those comics where we'd see adverts for Twinkies inside them and all of these, and suddenly here was a British inky thing, which was filled with something that did feel a bit more visceral and certainly, as you said, more cutting edge as well. And that seems very important. And Louie, I mean, when you're writing, do you feel the hand of those comic books on your shoulder? Do you feel that imagination that you saw explored there?
Yeah, I think because 2000 AD was so many different worlds, it was space, it was the future, it was, Thatcher's Britain. It makes me feel in a hurry to write lots of different things. Like I want to pack it all in like 2000 AD did. But I think also I sort of feel a duty for children now to give them what I can do in terms of like quite a clear-sighted vision of at least how I see the world, and maybe get them to ask questions about how they see it. Because I think with 2000 AD, it was always asking questions like Judge Dredd, obviously the protagonist, but also a fascist. And I'm rooting for him and I'm confused and I sort of want to be him, but also, oh no, he's really bad. And I think I like that discomfort, and I like that for readers as well, however, young or old they are.
That's an interesting thing, isn't it? That kind of sometimes sliding between fascism and socialism and other, which is what we see so much in the comic book industry. There are certain comic book writers that have got to late middle age and you go, they've become the late middle age fascists. And then we have, one of the great 2000 AD writers, obviously Alan Moore, who I still consider to be, he's a good, if you're going to have someone as your kind of, ethical guidelines, I think Alan is still doing pretty well at whatever he is, 67 years old now. What about for you, Ian, in terms of this, as you said, the comic books that came before, they really did seemed like a revolution to, as an 8-year-old. There was nothing like this.
Yeah, and if you were the age that I was when I started reading it, which was, around about 77, 78, 16, 17, 18 years old, a time of punk, and you felt like a punk as well. Here was something that had a punk attitude to it. It didn't seem to give a damn. It was pushing boundaries all over the place. It was extraordinary. The visceral nature of some of the art, the visceral storytelling, the fact that it could be incredibly bleak, and yet this was a comic aimed at kids. And produced by just a handful of people. In later years, I've got to meet some of the people who were around at the very start, people like Alan Grant. And you realize there were only about 2 or 3 people working on this comic at any one time under a series of pseudonyms. So it looked like it was a much bigger staff than there actually was. And so there was a kind of punk mentality going on. It was a thing like, let's just get this done. Let's get it out there and see what happens. It's a bit like Sniffing Glue, the punk magazine, where they gave you 3 chords on the front of page 1 and said, now go and form a band. And so you got the feeling that you could have a go at this, you could try this. And at the same time, it felt very grown up. If you were, again, a teenager, if you got the references, you went, oh, look, Judge Dredd is going to Huntertwasserblock. He's an artist. I know that name. You felt suddenly very clever. I remember a couple of friends and me who were big 2000 AD fans, I think possibly our first year at university, when suddenly somebody said the words Rojaws and Hammerstein, and we went, it's Rodgers and Hammerstein. And written down,
I've literally only just got that.
Written down, never got it. As soon as it was said out loud, I went, "It's Rodgers and Hammerstein." How's a kid supposed to get that these two robots fighting future wars are actually based on people who wrote musicals for the stage?
Well, that seems, Lauren, again, the multi-layers of a world, which is, it would be very easy just to write a story where here's just a story, but it's that fact that there are, I mean, it almost makes me, when you're saying that, Ian, it reminds me of things like The Magic Roundabout, where Eric Thompson would have so many different layers, which would include references to Sergei Eisenstein. Now, it didn't matter whether you missed, as a child, when Dougal, a dog, has a camera and at one point says, "I bet this never happened to Sergei Eisenstein." I didn't immediately, as a 5-year-old, think, father, Sergei Eisenstein. But it kind of gets embedded. And I think, Lauren, as a storyteller, do you feel that bit where you go, sometimes there's things which are not important to the story as a whole, but they just mean that you can start to feel a little bit more of that world and return to that world. And that means that as you said, like, you suddenly see Rodgers and Hammerstein, you see a certain name, and you have that Proustian rush as you return to the dystopia of your childhood.
I can't say I've had experience that directly, but I will say that I brought my collection of 2000 ADs with me from the time I was 15 to 45, and they've moved across countries and continents with me. Because, and I haven't reread them in years, but those stories were so foundational and fundamental to who I was and who I am. Because stories inhabit you, right? They kind of climb inside you and they colonize you and they fester and they become interesting new things. And that connection is like very real and very deep for me. And it will always be a huge part of my life. And one of the things I absolutely loved about 2000 AD was that they had really incredible female characters who weren't just sexy. Some of them were sexy. Durham Red definitely has like a lot of kind of vicious vampish sex appeal. But someone like Judge Anderson was just phenomenal and like such an empath and so brutalized by, what she experienced and what she went through. And her whole story with the Dark Judges was just absolutely phenomenal. And of course, Halo Jones, which is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah, Halo Jones is. And I also think of Skiz as well. Do you remember? It was Skiz.
Yes, I love Skiz.
Skiz is fantastic. Louie, what about for you? I was thinking one of the things about 2000 AD, again, we've mentioned it a couple of times, was that grit? Was that the dirt of it, where science fiction, when you look at a lot of 1960s science fiction, when you look at greats, things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, it's a clean and bright world. And then we have that kind of Ridley Scott alien world, which to me, I remember when I first saw that, it felt like that was part of 2000 AD's universe. Actually, the future will still have people living mucky, horrible lives and having to eat reconstituted shit.
Yeah, I think for me with Halo Jones, it was the fact when I had one of those realization moments of the parallel with, our world, was like, oh, they're on the dole. And like the space dole still exists and this horrific poverty and divided society, literally living on this hoop away from people. And then, the billionaires swanning in and with their fancy spaceships. So I think it was that. It wasn't just the dirt, it was also the sort of social divides that really resonated, in ways that I could not articulate age 8, but I was just aware that there was just like, all the dark stuff in the world has been brought into 2000 AD, but just they've added spaceships and blaster pistols and things.
Ian, who were you most drawn to? Because I think the thing that I loved most actually was I used to love Tharg's Future Shocks. I loved Strontium Dog, but Tharg's Future Shocks, the excitement of those little, sometimes 3 or 4 page stories, the beautiful twists and the number of, again, ideas that they dealt with. What drew you? What was the first page you would turn to when you picked up 2000 AD?
I mean, pretty much anything written by Alan Moore. So the Time Twisters and the Future Shocks and stuff like that. D.R.N. Quinch was just absolutely blew me away. As storytelling as much as anything else. I was attracted to the Judge Dredd stories because they just create an extraordinary world. There was Mega City 1 was extraordinary, and the land outside the walls was extraordinary. And I just thought it was phenomenal. It was like watching Blade Runner over and over again, but with Clint Eastwood fronting it, and And yes, he's a fascist, and you shouldn't be on his side, and yet somehow you are, because you understand at a deep level that there has to be order. That society needs order. If you've got chaos, then you just have rampant chaos, and anybody and everybody is after everything. But taking it to an extreme, it reminded me a lot, actually, Judge Dredd's world of A Clockwork Orange, which I hadn't been allowed to see as a kid because it was banned, or Stanley Kubrick had withdrawn it from circulation. But I'd read the book when I was 12, 13, 14. I'd read it many times. And this world that Alex, the hero, comes into, where all the thugs who he used to go around with, he comes out of incarceration and finds that they are now cops. They are now in charge of, they can do to him whatever they want, and he can't fight back. There's that extraordinary sense that you get the police that the society deserves in a way. And so this very tough policing went hand in hand with a kind of very anarchic breakdown of society. So it just seemed to be that this was maybe where Britain and elsewhere, other countries were headed in the late 70s, early 80s, that we seemed to be headed towards this anarchy. And I was on the side of the anarchists as well. So when Chopper comes along and starts spray painting stuff, smiley faces everywhere, you go, yay, I don't want you to get caught. Yeah. And obviously nobody wanted Chopper to get caught, because Chopper kept coming back and mostly getting away with it.
That's it. When you were talking about that, and I was just thinking then about the different youth culture things, like the youth culture books of Richard Allen and the skinhead books and stuff, and they were basically on the side of the fascists, though. So I think, which is, I mean, I wonder for you, Lauren, about looking back at those. You mentioned Strontium Dog. What now do you feel is the character that you would return to most? Because I think there is some very prescient stuff in 2000 AD.
Look, I mean, definitely Halo Jones. I love the Western aspect of Strontium Dog. I think Zenith was really interesting. And really playful, and I think it broke superheroes in a really interesting way. As Alan Moore did, obviously, with Watchmen. I think I was never on Judge Dredd's side. I never really related to his stories that often. Kind of, they were fine. I'd buy the issues because I had to have the complete collection. But it was Judge Anderson. It was. That company was just absolutely phenomenal. Like the storytelling there and the ending was just devastating. And surprisingly, for someone who really doesn't like war comics, oh God, I've forgotten the name. Thank you, Rogue Trooper. I was thinking Rogue One. I'm like, that is not correct. Completely different story. But yeah, so Rogue Trooper I thought did war very, very well. And I thought the last season of Halo Jones did war very well, and Bad Company as well. I think maybe it was because I was living under a fascist state and a racist state where poor people were ruthlessly suppressed, that maybe Judge Dredd didn't feel as fun. Although it was cool when he went out into, the Badlands.
Yeah, it's funny because I think I thought of Judge Dredd as a victim of the system, whereas I think now as an adult, I don't. I think if you're complicit in the system, you're not a victim. But I was like, well, they cloned him. It wasn't his fault. He had to do this. But I was just thinking about characters that I like now versus then. And I think Nemesis, I've always liked what Nemesis looks like, but I think as a character now and as what he stands for means a lot more to me now as an adult.
Yeah.
Thinking about what it means to sort of fight against a radicalized group, which, could be anything, but I don't know, looking now is transphobes, but there's whatever group it is, it applies to anything. And what it means to be pure, because I think kind of that idea of purity is something that's so interesting. Once you kind of get into your muddy middle age where, everything's complicated. There's no simple lines anymore. Well, not for me. The danger of purity, and also, I guess, always identifying with the deviant. That's what I did enjoy that as a kid, and I enjoy that now in a slightly different way.
Well, also the art. Sorry, Robin. The art was just nothing I'd ever seen before. The character design in Nemesis was just so strange and bizarre.
Yeah, it was always a toss-up for me whether I was going to draw Judge Dredd or Nemesis. I thought I drew them on equal, obsessiveness.
You were touching on that there, Louie, as well about, I think for a lot of us, when we look back at 2000 AD and some of the other things as well of science fiction, it was an introduction to ideas, certainly for my generation, I think ideas of a counterculture, because I'm not old enough to have really been in that when counterculture was a more dominant thing. And also that bit of being an outsider kid, something like 2000 AD, in a way that Victor comic was not, or Whizzer and Chips, or whatever it might have been. 2000 AD started to create, to me, I think, a code for some of the other kids that you would then find yourself hiding in that corner of the playground talking about that. And I think those things, and things like Doctor Who as well, do seem to be such a lifeline for young people who feel that they are not part of the mainstream. Louie?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose like Doctor Who is the like nice version where everything can end okay, whereas 2000 AD it's really not better. But at the same time, yes, it's definitely the outsider as the main character always, which is fascinating. And I mean, I used to read, as well as read my dad's pile of 2000 ADs, had The Eagle as well, kind of going back to the 60s. And with that, I think it was the art that I loved. It's absolutely, that was stunning, painterly stuff. But the ethics was always really off-putting because it was this very kind of colonialist Boy Scout. We're just going to torch this planet and make it okay, or kill everyone. So 2000 AD, I felt like ethical truth in a different way.
Tonally, 2000 AD was really interesting because some of the comics we've spoken about that came before it the tone was the same all the way through. The Bash Street Kids seem to have a very similar vibe to Dennis the Menace, had a very similar vibe to Desperate Dan or whatever. You came to 2000 AD, one story would be a harsh dystopia set in future. The next story could be quite fun. It could be Sam Slade, Robo Hunter, which is based on kind of, noir stories, but done with a very light touch with his Robo Stogie that talks back to him and stuff. Ace Trucking Company with Freak the Freak, just absolutely gorgeous. Great illustrations, great art, but also really fun, light storytelling. And so there was you turn the page and it'd be a story that was completely different in feel to the story you just finished. And so it was asking quite a lot of you as a reader. It was saying, are you able to take these sudden switches from this kind of storytelling to that kind of storytelling? And of course, you are then going to have your favorites because they were very different. Every issue had this real selection box element to it. And I liked all of it, including the Curly Wurly.
It was interesting. My dad he threw away my collection of Misty comics, which was a horror comic for girls.
Yeah.
But he didn't touch my 2000 ADs. And I think he was, I think he missed a thing there because I think 2000 AD was much more dangerous and subversive.
Did you think the Misty would be like witchcraft or something?
Yeah, like satanic-y.
It was a bit, right?
Yeah, no, totally. There was absolutely an episode or an issue where, Satan took control of the girls' school.
Well, that's it. The Misty stuff. I mean, it's interesting. Even Bunty, actually, I bought a bunch of Bunty albums when I was at annuals when I was in Southwold a few months back, and they had much more intricate stories than a lot of the ones that were meant for boys at the time. Some were very. There's one adventure all about a girl who's not only got a pet griffin, but it's also invisible. And it's on works on something, but this is this brings the girls' school thing brings me to one of the points I want to talk a little bit about, which is about class in 2000 AD, because I know that it's something that Alan Moore's talked about and some of the other writers and artists as well, which is a lot of the comics they were brought up on in the 50s and 60s were about people in kind of boarding schools, and it was a lot of it was nice middle class and upper middle class people with horses. And then you get this, around the time, some of the American comics, and then also 2000 AD, suddenly it seems to be a much broader tableau of the people who are the heroes, the villains, and part of that story. That it seems to break out from some of the class, restrictions that we might have seen in some comic books. I don't know, Lauren, if you noticed that at all.
Definitely, so I did read Bunty and I want to say Ginty, but there were a bunch of British girls comics that we could get, but a lot of them were about horses or ballet classes. And even when there was a cool murder mystery attached to the ballet, I was like, I don't care about ballet. And look, I went, I did not have 2000 AD as a marker as a way into another friendship group because I went to an all girls private school. I went to Rodin, Johannesburg. So I was living that kind of private girls' school life. And And I think that made me more of a freak than an outcast. And I think that made 2000 AD like, just such a lifeline for me as this kind of like weirdo and, finding stories which really spoke to me. But yeah, I think it does tackle class in really interesting ways. I think there are working class heroes. I think the way it deals with society and Judge Dredd does that very well. The fascism works because the society is so fundamentally broken, and it's such a reflection of real society back then and now and heading towards the future, that I really think it was much more interesting than a lot of those other stories, which were very gentrified and very kind of genteel and proper.
And I think with 2000 AD, even if it's not actively dealing with class, what it does is it centers working class heroes as though that's just obvious. That's who's always going to be the hero. So obviously Hayden Jones is the hero,
Exactly.
And I think, because 2000 AD was my way into comics, so I don't really have that sort of, I didn't have the before, I just had the after, I just had the punk. But I did later read some of the other stuff. I guess I read The Eagle as well, but I was quite aware that The Eagle was from a long time ago, so I don't think I judged it by the same standards. A bit like when you watch black and white films with your parents or something, you'd just be like, well, that was another time, so I'll put it in a different box. But I guess all the children's books I probably read at the same time would have been the, Narnia and stuff that had your very well-to-do children. Apart from Jan Mark, who I don't know, sadly quite forgotten now, but she was big in the 80s when I was a kid. And she always wrote some really good kind of working class heroes in, her books were set in like state secondary schools. It was very much about, a girl who's into football and likes shouting at people, but it was rare. It was definitely rare. And I think 2000 AD brought that as well, where it did kind of felt like it wasn't operating in a safe, weird Edwardian bubble that so much of children's books does. And I think, children's books to an extent still does that, and not everywhere, but I think there is that weird nostalgia for, I don't know, like 1890 to 1920, where it's sort of children's book land, not the real time, because obviously like historical fiction is slightly different. It's more that when fantasy is aimed at children, often it's like, everything's made of clockwork, and we weirdly wear Victorian clothes for no reason in this parallel fantasy world with the unicorns, So yeah, 2000 AD is that kind of, I guess it's that antidote that's, I guess I had it before the poison, but it's still an antidote,
I think there's no doubt for me that, as a working class kid, that comics were the gateway drug to literature, the gateway drug to all kinds of stories. But also, they were a gateway for writers and artists. Anybody could rock up, it seemed to me, at 2000 AD offices in London and get a job. They were very welcoming to new and young writers and gave them a chance, gave them a break. Mark Millar, I think, just started sending them stuff. I wish I'd had the guts to do it. If I'd had the guts to start sending them stuff, I might now be a comic book writer and not a jobbing novelist with all the glamour that the comic book writer has around him. I could be Neil Gaiman, Mark II, Neil Gaiman 2.0, I could be.
I think, though, you are using the example of someone who does have that glamour life. I think there's a lot of other comic book writers going, tell you what, I wish I'd gone here.
Most of the comic book writers watching this are crying.
Yeah. Well, I wondered, Ian, when you were reading 2000 AD, so where did it, was it a springboard into? Had you been into science fiction, for instance, before? Or was this the start of looking at any of that world and maybe the world of people like Philip K. Dick or Ursula K. Le Guin?
You know what? It wasn't, Robin. It didn't, I've never been a big reader of science fiction and fantasy in book form. I hate to say it, but it's true. Love the films, love the TV shows. But I just used to have this conversation a lot with Ian M. Banks. He called his science fiction novel Skiffy. And I said, I've tried your Skiffy books and I just can't. There's something blocking me from enjoying these stories. Although I loved hanging out with Ian Banks and I read all these non sci-fi books. 2000 AD, just led me to other comics. So when the British writers trampolined from 2000 AD and other comics to America and started working for DC and Vertigo and Marvel and everybody else, I went with them. And by this time I was married and living in Tottenham in London, and it had a comic shop. It had an actual comic shop, and I would go in there. I remember the guy who ran it saying to me, "You'll love this, issue 1 Watchmen. It's Alan Moore." I went, "Oh, and bring it on," because I'd been reading his Swamp Thing stuff. So, that took me to Swamp Thing, took me to everything that Mark Millar was going to produce, and all these other great writers and artists were going to produce, the Dave McKeans of this world and everybody else. So I liked British storytellers. I liked British artists. And even when I went to America, I think they had a bigger effect on America than America had on their style. So American comics became a lot edgier. Okay, they already had The Dark Knight, but they became a lot edgier because of all these British writers and artists who were bringing their stuff with them. And so that was where it eventually led me. I should say on my wedding, my wife still holds this up to me. On my wedding day, when she was getting her hair done, I was off getting 2000 AD because it was the day that 2000 AD was published. I had to go and get 2000 AD and read it before I got my morning suit on to go to the church to get married. My wife is furious about that 30 odd years on.
So you were still reading it as you walked down the aisle. I can see that would be
pretty much rolled up in my pocket in my jacket,
Sorry, it's
the ring pulls out the 2000 AD.
What about the new influence for you, Lauren? Once you started reading 2000 AD, was that a springboard into other areas of kind of writing that you hadn't looked at before?
So my mom got me into fantasy. My dad got me into science fiction. So, I read Dragonlance and ElfQuest. But then I also read a lot of Philip K. Dick, Ursula Le Guin. So I think I was already very much kind of in that mode, but I don't know if I would have been a comic writer if it hadn't been for 2000 AD. And I think it really gave me an understanding of what you could do with storytelling. And South African theatre did this very well as well, because we had a lot of sanctions and we also had censorship where you weren't allowed to tackle things directly. You weren't allowed to talk about how evil the apartheid government was and, hey, maybe we shouldn't force people to live in a racist state. So people in theatre, people used a lot of kind of analogs and, mythology or fables as a way of kind of exploring actually what apartheid was doing. And I thought 2000 AD reflected that so well as well. And I was like, oh, this is a way of getting at reality in a really interesting and engaging way, is through allegory, is through parable, and putting this kind of science fiction twist or this alternate reality twist on what already exists. And that's absolutely fed into my novels, from Zoo City, which is, about a magical Johannesburg, to The Shining Girls, which is about a time traveling serial killer, but it's really about the mistakes we make in history, which come up again and again. And how we talk about femicide and what femicide is and what it does to us socially as a society and on a personal level. But if I'd written a book about femicide, which some of my friends have done, hardcore nonfiction, you don't reach the same kind of audience. And it's that kind of the Trojan horse of sneaking in like a really potent, powerful message and using your art to say something about the world, but having, robots and, electronic cigars and a war out in space.
Well, Louie, I find that very interesting about that. To me, science fiction and the kind of worlds that 2000 AD introduced me to, many of the, especially the shorter strips, are thought experiments. That they can be used so easily by people trying to, go, I need to popularize my philosophy lecture. How can I do it? Hang on a minute. I've just found this time twister. I've just found this particular Judge Dredd. This deals with, they do seem to me to have introduced us also to a little kind of philosophical ideas and ways of exploring. Louie, I just want.
Oh, that's me. Sorry. Yeah, no, I think it's true, and I particularly like those kind of future shock time twisters ones. I like when I'm writing, I really do like writing about ethics, but I'm also very aware that could, make someone yawn pretty quickly, especially if they're 8. So going at it via a what if. So like my book about Loki is what if Loki was turned into an 11-year-old boy and had to live on Earth as a mortal child with all the kind of humiliations that involves, and had to try and become a better person. What would that look like? So I guess it's asking, what does it mean to be a good person? And how do you go about doing that while life is quite hard? And I can't imagine sort of sitting down to a group of 8-year-olds and saying, so, what is the good life? Let's talk about Aristotle. But I think doing that through the lens of a god was an exciting, exploration for me, just as you might explore it through the lens of a future fascist or a girl who just went out.
Lauren, can I ask you, you wrote for 2000 AD for the 40th anniversary edition. What was your story for the 40th anniversary edition?
It was a Strontium Dog story, but we kind of quite heavily centered Durham Red. And we were riffing off, we named the bad guy for King Leopold, who just absolutely devastated the Congo. You know, he cut off people's hands, and in the rubber trade, it was just awful slavery and murder. So it was kind of like a neo-colonial revenge story, where it seems like Durham Red's actually trying to protect someone, but maybe she's betraying them, but maybe she's also trying to bag this big fish of, you know, this alien who's been completely exploiting a planet. And you know, Johnny Alpha's also there. But Durham was one I was excited to write.
Ian,
can we get hold of this somewhere? I'd love to read it.
Yeah, it's part of the 45th anniversary, but I can also send you the PDF. I mean, I can't. I definitely would not do that.
No. I'll get the issue.
Ian, who would you have written for then? You said you never sent anything to the mystical place of Kingsreach Tower, wasn't it? That was
Yeah.
Isn't that strange when you actually eventually saw it as an adult, and it was such a mystical place, and then you realised it was just people scurrying through their NMEs and Melody Maker upstairs and 2000 AD over there.
Yeah.
That sounds magical.
Yeah, of course it's magical, because it's what's happening inside all these people's heads is the real place. It's not the physical building; it's what's happening inside it and all the people that are in there. Same as with same as with NME and stuff. Well, I eventually did get the call. I got the call, but I got it, you know, many years later. Somebody from Vertigo Comics, DC Vertigo in New York, said, "You keep in interviews, you keep saying what a huge fan of comic books you are and stuff like, you know. Have you ever thought about writing one?" And I went, "What took you so long, guys?" You know, by this stage, I was well into my 40s, if not my 50s. And so I started pitching ideas. And the one that they liked was for a 200-page standalone with Constantine, John Constantine Hellblazer. So I did a 200-page standalone. That was my first ever comic. And, you know, a steep learning curve. Because the only script page I'd ever seen was one written by Alan Moore. And he's very peculiar in the amount of detail he puts into his scripts. And I thought that's how you do it. So I did it that way. And I learned a lesson, which is you don't need to put in all that detail. Give the artist, cut them a little bit slack, give them some leeway. But it was great. And I was working with Werther Della Idrea, who's become very big, very hot recently. He did the art for it, but I never met him, never spoke to him. It was all done. He was in, I don't know, Italy, Spain. I was in Edinburgh. The editor was in New York, and it all passed via the editor. So, but I think Werther's working now with James Tynion on Something is Killing the Children and stuff like that. So he did all right. It was one of his first comics, was this 200-page Constantine. I remember when it arrived, and I got very excited, and it's in black and white. I thought it was going to be in colour. And it was in black and white, and I went, But apart from that, it was fine.
Louis, what about, I mean, in terms of the storytelling style, I mean, I always think that with your books, they manage to be both concise and fabulous, you know, that kind of, which is what a comic so often has to be, is to try and manage to encase so much of a story in so few words and so few images. And I think you managed to very often, you know, Loki, which as I said, I've only just started on now. But there's so many images that you just create in people's heads. So you're still obviously working in images. I wondered how the comic style, whether it has actually influenced the way that you approach writing for young people.
Yeah, I think I've always been interested in both like straight up comics, you know, strip stuff, but also where you get into that hybrid space. So something like Posey Simmons, where you will have, you know, she'll kind of use there'll be a letter on the page, and then there'll be a bit of comic strip and a pastiche of 18th century art. And I really enjoy the kind of exploring that sort of, I guess, the physicality of a book, which I think I'm very aware of when I'm reading a comic. It is an object, not just, you know, sometimes if you're reading just text, sometimes it's like the words are going into your brain, but not necessarily that much mediated by the book. Whereas with the comic, I'm quite aware of the book. So I like thinking of kind of the Loki book, say, is like almost like a medieval manuscript with the illuminations, and you've got the text and the images interacting, and then some straight up comic strips, but also kind of lots of labels everywhere. Because I like, you know, that's kind of how I think. I like that like messy, very kind of spatial thinking. like a bit like the narrative equivalent of the murder board, where you have everything's a spider diagram. But I think also in 2000 AD, I think it was very good at this, that kind of everything's very concise, because if you're going to have an issue that has multiple stories in it, and to get you to kind of switch from one to the other, and each story is only a part of a story, you really have to get to the point quite quickly. There's none of that kind of rambling, self-indulgent, let's just have a page of a character staring into the distance and then pulling on their, boots, except in the one story where he pulls on his boots, and that's the significant moment. But generally it's very kind of bam, bam, bam. And also the dialogue is what really lifted 2000 AD for me. It's just all these funny people saying funny things to each other, in great peril and while being shot at. Sinister and Dexter always had the best kind of banter, I think.
Lauren, what about, do you feel that it's an advantage or a disadvantage to be stuck in what is technically described as genre writing, with Ian as well, it's still seen that people who write kind of, crime thrillers and people who write science fiction and people who write horror, it's a kind of in a different corner of the bookshop, and maybe you have to order some of that stuff as well. And I think that gives it also a great advantage in terms of where you can go, that there's something exciting. But do you feel that it would be better if these things were more embraced as just being mixed with all the other books and not in their own special section?
Well, I think we should, literary is its own genre. So are rom-coms and ladlit and chicklit. And, the idea that there is fiction and then crime and science fiction and horror is ridiculous. Like, we're all intermingled. And, and as soon as like a literary writer, like someone like Colson Whitehead, suddenly gets into genre, it's like this kind of groundbreaking, amazing, wow, he's like really, slumming it. It's like, no, the genre is like where the exciting ideas happen. And I think what genre does so very well is explore the fractal lines of society. And I think crime does that very well. Noir, horror, absolutely. And science fiction and fantasy as well. Like, we really kind of get into the nitty gritty of things. And again, I think it comes down to personal choice. For me, I find it very liberating. For me, I find it's very exciting space to play in. But I do want to pick up on writing for 2000 AD when it was 1996, I think, and I was backpacking around the world, and I was in England, and I was just about to go home to South Africa, and a job ad came up that for 2000 AD to be a writer. And I so desperately wanted to go for it. And I was way too intimidated. And I was like, oh, but my visa is about to run out and I have to go home. And I wonder what that reality would have been like if I'd actually, cowgirled up and gone through and followed that up. That would have been really cool.
Ian, how do you feel about still that kind of sense of the called genre writing? And it's like with Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood, a lot of people will say they try and pretend that she doesn't write a lot of science fiction because she's now, considered so literary. And of course, she just writes great stories. And it happens that a lot of them are within what we would consider to be a science fiction world. Are you glad to still be perhaps slightly, I know obviously you're a best-selling author, but in some ways still the reviews, we don't seem to have as many reviews as a lot of the kind of stuff that's considered to be genre. It doesn't get spoken about in such highfalutin ways.
I think it used to bother me a lot more than it does now, because back in the bad old days when I started writing crime fiction definitely wasn't taken seriously in the UK, but crime fiction is taken a lot more seriously in the UK now, and other kinds of writing still are looked down on. So the historical novel, the romance novel, women's fiction, science fiction, horror are still looked down on. In a way that crime isn't, and I'm just hoping everybody else gets a rung up the ladder, the same as crime has happened with crime. Now, crime novels, you can study them sometimes in high school, definitely in universities, they're on various syllabuses, et cetera, and literary novelists, Colson's been mentioned, will write crime fiction, when they get the ideas. And that's what happens with me, is I get the idea for the story first, or the theme that I want to explore, and then I think, what kind of story will allow me to explore this? And almost always I think, well, this sounds to me like it could be a crime novel, and mostly it's featuring the same character. Not always, but mostly. But that's because the story, that's just the best way of telling that story. And if I got an idea for a story that couldn't be contained in a crime novel, I would write that story. But I don't think things are nearly as bad for crime fiction as they were a generation or two ago. And part of that is down to the fact that young writers have come along who see no shame in writing crime fiction. A generation ago, they would have wanted to be thought of as literary novelists. And now it doesn't bother them in the least. They would rather have the sales than the review in the Times Literary Supplement.
And Louis, I'm just thinking that there's a Marvel universe which is, just seems to be churning out an enormous, spin-off after spin-off. There's the DC universe. We haven't yet got a kind of 2000 AD cinematic universe. Obviously, we've had a reasonably terrible version of Judge Dredd in the 90s, and then what I personally thought was a pretty good Judge Dredd movie in the last 10 years.
It's filmed in South Africa.
Yeah,
it's a perfect place to do it.
What did you think of that movie, Lauren?
No, I thought it was great. I thought it was really fun, and yeah. And my friend Joe died in it, as he does in every movie.
Is that his job?
He's an actor, and he somehow ends up dying. He's died in God, I can't remember any name. Starship Troopers 3. He's died in Black Sails. He's died in Judge Dredd. He at least got a named death in Judge Dredd, but yeah.
But he only dies in really good films, though.
That's good. No, absolutely. Yes, some. I don't know about Starship Troopers.
he's the Sean Bean of his generation.
Yeah, exactly.
As long as your death makes the edit, that's the main thing. But who would you, Louis? If you were now someone said, right, we've got 2000 AD universe. It's time that we started to make movies. Where is the screenplay for you? Which person are you going to think? Right, this is the story we need to.
I think I've got to go Halo Jones. I want a big budget for the Clara Pandy.
Yeah.
I want a really scary robot dog. This is not going to be a family movie. It's going to be quite gross, but it's also going to be, reflecting the modern day society. And I want a really big, energetic kind of dance score. I think a really kind of really dirty, something you would listen to at 4 a.m. in an underground club. I haven't been clubbing for a while, but I imagine. And I basically want every 13-year-old to want to be her.
So that you're going to make the movie where you won't believe it. Alan Moore actually liked my film of his work. I always have that image of like the guy who made that terrible League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and I've heard from some of the people who were on set at the time about and I'd imagine that when he first sat down, he thought, I'm going to be the one that's going to make the movie that Alan, and then slowly you go, this is not going very well at all. Oh man! So what about for you, Ian? What's going to be your first 2000 AD universe screenplay?
Sam Slade. It's got to be. Update the gumshoe. Get all the elements of Blade Runner, but with a lot of laughs. So the kids will love it. I'm reminded though. I've got the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I've got a story about that because I once was invited to meet Sean Connery because he wanted me to ghost his autobiography. And I thought, right, Ian, you're meeting Sean Connery. Take a DVD, get him to sign a DVD. And in my rush to leave, the first thing I found was League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the film that basically ended his career. He did after that no more movies. And I took it along and I said, oh, by the way, Sean, can you say? He went, we're fucking. The director was a madman, an absolute madman, the director. And but he signed it to me. And I probably that is the only signed copy of that film in existence, because I doubt Sean wanted to sign too many of those.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's such a, we won't need to talk about that film anymore. Lauren, what about for you? So which are you entering the 2000?
Well, I think Louis and I are going to have to collaborate on Halo. I think I did have some talks a couple of years ago about it. But what I think for me would be a really important thing now is I would like Halo to be a woman of color, a young queer woman. And I think that I just feel that would be a much better update of who she is, and speak more to where we are in society right now. But yeah, but you'd absolutely need a huge budget, and it'd be so interesting to track her whole life. Yeah.
Just saying, Lux Rothchop as a woman would be quite hot.
Oh yes. Now I'm trying to cast her.
Yeah.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of people leaving comments afterwards to give you
the one thing everyone goes away with.
What about the renaming 2000 AD? Because the thing I was thinking, my son was born in 2007, and when he really got into comics, I was in a Reading Oxfam, and I found some old 2000 ADs, and I took them back to him, and his first reaction was, "But that was ages ago, Dad." And I think it's quite an interesting thing that, you know, for us, we can still see 2000 AD as just this idea of a future, but for him, as certainly when he was 10 years old, this was a very strange idea that a future comic set so far in the past. So have we any thoughts of, because that's always what you always think when you watch those movies, which go, it's 1997 and Manhattan has been turned into it, and you go, always starting the screenplay, it's the near future. Yeah. The near future is always a little bit. So have we got any ideas for the rename your 2000 AD for those kids who are feeling it's a historical examination?
I was just wondering, though, if it might just become a word. You know how like the save icon is a disc and no one knows what that is anymore? It's almost like it's just, I don't know, it's a word, but it doesn't have to mean the year. It just becomes a symbol of something magical and exciting.
I'm sure they went through. I'm sure they've been through this. I'm sure 2000 AD, the editorial staff have thought many times, do we need to rebrand? I mean, 2000 AD, you know, to start with was twinned with another comic. It was two comics, and it kept blending in with other comics and the best characters from other comics. And that used to happen all the time when I was young. That one week you'd be buying Whizzer, the next week it was Whizzer and Chips, and two comics had become one. And just the best elements of both were kept there. And I think it's to 2000 AD's credit that it's kept the brand, that 2000 AD still means something. When you say the word, the image it conjures up is still relevant. Although 2000 AD, the year might be a long way in the past, 2000 AD as a brand still means something relevant. And it pertains because of that. It hasn't been swamped by other comics because it is such a strong brand.
What was it? I can't. It wasn't Star-Lord, was it? What was the?
Yeah. And Warrior
yeah. So that means it was 2000 AD and Star-Lord when it started. That was the God, I'd forgotten that.
I'm just thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it previously, but just off the top of my head, maybe 0 AD, or just.
But it's interesting.
But that would read OED, and that would not. Good.
But you're right. There is something about 2000 AD becomes in a space in the block universe that is this kind of uncanny space, doesn't it? It's this space which allows it to be. It's like when you watch an old spaghetti western where they didn't have enough of a budget to build anything beyond 3 houses, and therefore suddenly it just became, every town becomes a ghost town. Every returning gunfighter becomes the ghost of a gunfighter, whether it's as deliberate as High Plains Drifter. And I think that's what I see as 2000 AD. That bit of time in the block universe where it sits is this mystical time of what the future was to be and always what it was to be. So the final thing, what would you like 2000 AD to explore? What areas in terms of science fiction, in terms of kind of the future possibilities, or indeed using the future possibilities to explore the past? What areas would you like to see 2000 AD going into in the next 45 years?
So I think they should ask me to guest edit an African issue where we just find amazing African writers and tell stories from the continent.
That's very interesting. Louie?
I would like... it's a tricky one. I was still really interested in like deep space and finding other worlds. So I'd love to do, special edition on life on other worlds, in our distant future. What would the human race be like when it's spread out across the galaxy, or what happens to the people that are left?
Ian?
Well, I mean, various stories down the years have dealt with ecology, but, it's more important now than ever. And especially if we can get to younger readers and say to them, by the way, we fucked up and you're going to have to clean it up, please. And here's a story that's going to give you some ideas that will tell you you've got a problem, but maybe it's not insurmountable, although it's getting that way. So something that isn't totally dystopian, but actually gives a little bit of hope for the generations coming along after us would be nice.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Louie. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, everyone. I hope there's loads more stuff coming up for the 45th anniversary of 2000 AD. It is right. How many of you, let's just check, right? We talked about this before we went on air. How many of you returned home one day and found out that your box of comics had been thrown away by your mum or your dad then? Ian?
My big sister, she'd given them to her friends. All her friends had taken them away.
Louie?
I don't know what happened to them. They're just gone somewhere. I know they've gone to a farm upstate to play with all the other 2000 ADs.
So some kind of wormhole connection to the farms as well. And Lauren, you said before that there was a preservation for yours.
Yeah, so my dad threw out my Misties, but I've been traveling with my 2000 AD collection, which went from 1987 to I think 1997. So like 10 years worth for 30 years. I have whittled it down to my favorites. I got rid of a lot of the dreads that I didn't like, but I've still got about 50 comics, which I put in a container and I shipped from South Africa to London 3 months ago. So yeah.
I'm going to throw one more actually quickly. 2000 AD cover. When I say that, what's the first one that you see?
Nemesis.
Louie?
Dark Judges.
Ian?
Yeah, just a big, huge Judge Dredd on his motorbike.
And the Judge Cal story as well.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one. Thank you very much. Now, everyone who hasn't had their 2000 AD thrown away, go and enjoy them and realise what a wonderful world that you have that was...
Go and look on eBay and see how much they're worth.
Ooh.
Oh, yeah, that's...
Scary.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, Louie and Ian.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this 2000 AD 45th anniversary panel, 2000 AD Beyond Borders. Although 2000 AD is considered a quintessentially British comic, air quotes, it has a long history of showcasing creators from many different countries and parts of the world, which proudly continues today. I'm Kelly Kanayama, a comics critic and scholar whose research focuses on Judge Dredd, among other comics. And I am here with Michael Carroll, Arthur Wyatt, and Chris Burnham to talk about working on 2000 AD from, I guess you could say, across the sea, the other side of the Greenwich Meridian, or however else you want to phrase it. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Hey.
So getting started, I'm sure this is a question you get asked a lot on these kinds of things, but what was your experience with 2000 AD? Like, did you read it growing up? Did you come to it as an adult, etc.? This is for everybody.
Sure. Yeah. I'll jump in because I'm nearest. I was reading from Prog 1, so I was a kid when it came out. Well, obviously I'm still a kid, but I was a kid when it came out, and so I got the very first issue, and I have all of them. I haven't stopped. So 2000 has been more important to me than almost anything else in my entire life besides my wife and oxygen. And I'm not even going to say in which order those two go. But yeah, so it's been a huge part of my life. I mean, I've been here from the very, very beginning. So yeah, God, I should move on. No, I'm happy where I am. So yeah, it's been very important to me. I've got every issue, and there was a point back about, I don't know, the early 2010s when I calculated that I'd earned more from 2008 than I'd spent on it. And I was able to say to my mother, told you I wasn't wasting my time reading those comics when I was a kid. So yeah. I don't think a day fails to go by when I don't rub that in her face.
I don't think I've hit break even.
Sorry, what?
I said, I don't think I've hit break even on that yet. But, yeah, so I got handed a Judge Dredd album annual when I was like I don't know, very small before I could read. And it was the 1982 one with all the sort of McMahon strips and the cutaway diagrams of things. And I just pored over that. So that was kind of my introduction. I didn't really read it properly till much later. And I sort of got started on the 2008 monthly and then finally started picking up the prog on the Bad Company cover that says War Zombies Bury 'em. So that's my vintage.
I think I first, as an American, it took me a while. I was aware of Judge Dredd just as like a thing that was out in the world, but I don't think I read a Dredd story until the Batman versus Judge Dredd Simon Beasley thing. And then there were some issues of Dredd Rules, which is like an early 90s Dredd compilation series. Like every issue had one of those Beasley like rock and roll stories as like the actual reason to buy it. And then there's a bunch of like weird catch-all stuff. Some of which really stuck with me. There's a one, I think it's called Strange Customs, where Dredd's running customs and there's this giant dude shows up and they interrogate him and they can't figure out what's this guy hiding. And they end up doing surgery on him and he's got like 8 hearts and like 3 livers. So he's like actually smuggling organs in, which I think about it all the time. Like every time I have to go through customs or whatever, I think about what they can find inside me. But I didn't start reading the prog proper until, I don't know, 10 years ago. Like once I've got back issues in physical form, but like I never subscribed to it until it was available digitally. So however old that is, 10 years ago, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't really that available in the US in physical form. I mean, not as a prog, if my memory serves me.
They've taken many cracks at reprinting this stuff in a million different formats, most of which I got when I was in my late 20s or whatever, when I was, had some disposable income and was at comic conventions all the time. Yeah. So I, got all the Strontium Dog and Slam Slade and like they put out a lot of stuff.
Did you get the quality?
Oh yeah, quality.
Quality.
Yeah, debatable quality. Just stretch that thing out; it'll be fine.
Yeah, aspect ratios. What are they?
Yeah, just all planets are ellipses in the future.
What about you, Kelly? How did you find?
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm actually in a similar boat to Chris. I mean, without the Simon Bisley Batman things, I read those after I get into Judge Dredd. I also started, I think, about 10 years ago. It was just because I was part of this comics group on Facebook, and everybody always talked about Judge Dredd, and I'd heard of him, of course. I was aware of, like Chris, I was aware of him as a guy in comics, but I didn't really know anything about it. And I thought, okay, I'm going to figure out what everyone is talking about. And so I just started at the beginning. And
bold.
Yeah. But
wow.
I think that helped because I got to see sort of how the comic started out from the really early days, when it was aimed at children still. And I think that tickled the part of my brain that thought, man, I remember being a kid. It would have been so cool if I'd read this when I was a kid. And I think from there, it just developed into this weird fascination with all the sort of strangeness of the satire and the world that so many people over time had created, and the sort of weird concepts of America that came through in what at the time was being written by just a bunch of British guys, some of whom had firsthand experience of America, like John Wagner, and some who clearly did not.
Yeah. Well, John is American, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But he lived in the UK so long that he was able to get a different perspective.
Accent.
Yeah. But it is interesting though that Judge Dredd created in a British comic is created by an American and a Spaniard, who Carlos being the artist when he comes from Spain.
Yeah, exactly.
So they automatically come in with a different perspective. They're not following. They weren't following what was then the tradition of standard boys British comics. They came in with a different idea. And of course, with Pat Mills and Alan Grant and all the other people involved, they were booking the trend from the beginning. But yeah, I'm a kind of a historian, I suppose, of British comics to some degree. But it was just when 2008 came out first, we were all like 11 years old in school, and we were going, "Oh my! This is what comics should have been like all along." Everything else we've been reading up to that point pretty much was tame in comparison, just in terms of the ideas. It was electric, and it still is to some degree. I mean, I still get a buzz every morning every Monday morning when the letterbox flaps, and I run downstairs to see has the prog arrived, and I go, "Hey!" and I rip it open. And if it's a Judge Dredd story written by me, I'm disappointed because I know what happens. If it's someone else's, I'm like, "Yay!"
Well, speaking of different perspectives, Michael Carroll, you coming from an Irish background, which I think, to my layperson's perspective, I feel like in some ways it's a lot closer to Britain than some others might. Yeah, other cultural ones might be, but in some ways it's very different.
Yeah, we are two nations separated by a common language, as the old joke goes. But geographically, of course, I mean, I can drive to the United Kingdom from here if we count Northern Ireland. Right. It's a Northern Ireland as well as an ordinary Ireland. Everybody just know that. I can drive there from here if I'm allowed. But so we have the Irish have a complicated relationship with the British, particularly with the English. But we have. When the first issue of 2008 came out, and it opens with the story Invasion, which has got foreign tanks tunneling across London, and it was supposed to be quite a shocking image, and we're going, no, we're used to seeing British foreign invaders on our land. It wasn't sure. We saw it on the news. But yeah, so we have a different kind of perspective than any solely British creators might have. But we're not that far removed. But we also have the victim mentality, which we're really good at playing up. Oh, you oppressed us for 800 years, blah, 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 blah. And that means for the next 800 years, we get to keep going on about it. So, we have a long way to go. We still have 700 years to keep going. So, yeah, but we don't have the quite the same attitude that others might have to the British. We hate them, but at the same time, we still want to be their friend.
Well, how does that translate into writing something like Judge Dredd?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I remember reading that Garth Ennis was saying, because Garth Ennis is from Ireland as well, and from the Northern Ireland. He said one of the problems he had was that he was too enamored of Dredd to properly write him. I'm not sure how he feels now. And at the beginning, I had the same problem. I was too much of a fan. It wasn't necessarily because I was Irish, but because I'd grown up reading this guy, and I was in awe of the character. And I realized I had to scale back everything and write Dredd as a person rather than write him as a superhero, that kind of thing. But I don't think my Irishness necessarily had any impact. Except for the story that I actually wrote that was set here, which was good fun.
I was actually going to ask you about that. I mean, you've reincorporated post-apocalyptic Ireland back into the Dredd universe with Judge Fintan Joyce.
Yeah, I had to do that because Garth and Steve Dillon had done that with the Emerald Isle storyline, where they basically made Ireland into this kind of theme park, which was, it was basically shamrocks and leprechauns all over the place. And I mean, it is like that in real life, of course, but we don't want people to know that. But, so I figured, well, hang on a minute. That was always a bit diddly idle, tip of your hat and top of the morning to you kind of thing, which the problem with Dredd is that if you do any kind of parody in Dredd, it's still part of the canon. It still becomes real, because unlike Batman or Spider-Man, we can't just pretend things didn't happen. Dredd ages in real time. So I figured, well, hang on, it's been 30 years. Let's go back to the Emerald Isle and show a more toned down perspective on it. So, I mean, I had different types of Irishy things, like, for example, when they get to Judge Joyce's mammy's house, she makes them take off their boots outside the door. So Dredd spends the rest of the episode with his stripy socks. And she basically insists that Dredd will have a cup of tea, even though he doesn't want one, this kind of thing. So I think it gave me a chance to have a little bit of fun with it, but at the same time, paper over some of the things that Garth and Steve did with the Emerald Isle, which was still hilarious, by the way. The spud guns and all that sort of stuff was just brilliant.
I mean, I do know from like talking to PJ that there is actually a potato-themed theme park in Ireland, which seems beyond anything that...
It's themed around the Tato brand of crisps. Like, it's not even just potatoes. It's themed around a crisp
Yes,
brand.
I know. It's shameful. It used to be a Butlins and now it's Tato theme park.
Well, that's better then.
I can't even look you all in the eye now. I'm too bad.
Is all the food like just crisps or what?
I don't know. I think you only go there if you're very, very, very badly behaved. I don't think.
Oh, road trip though.
Yeah, it's embarrassing, but there you go. But it's supposed to be great fun. I don't know. Other people talk now.
Well, Chris, you're American. What's that like? No, just in general. No, I was gonna actually say, you're one of the very few American artists to not just to do a cover for 2000 AD, but to do one for their 2000th Prague, which is a huge deal. Yeah. I looked it up. I think it's like you, Bill Sienkiewicz, and maybe one other person.
Yeah, something like that's crazy.
Yeah. So how do you take on the challenge of covering the galaxy's greatest comic on such an auspicious occasion?
I mean, it was very nerve-wracking. I'd done, I think, one cover before. I did the cover to 1950, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Which I guess must have come off all right. My friend Chris Moreno helped me with the this Dredd kind of in reflection. It's kind of tough to describe, but my buddy Chris Moreno helped me figure out the position of the guys getting killed in the background, because they had to perfectly fit into these shards of glass, and so it's one of those weird comic book puzzles where you have to have an organic pose that also fits perfectly into the space, allotted without kind of tangenting out in a weird, awkward way. And I couldn't crack the case, and he just figured it out so quick. It was so annoying. Like I've been slaving over this thing for 2 hours. He figures it out in 30 seconds. I was so mad. But yeah, I just got a weird email from Matt Smith saying, who is, the earthling incarnation of Tharg or whatever, however we kayfabe this out. Just in case you want to do a cover for Prague 2000. Like, holy, yes, I do want to do that. Very nerve-wracking. Rich Johnston told me years later that I only got the gig because Frank Whiteley turned it down first.
Jeez, that's so mean.
Harsh.
I mean, fair enough. It doesn't bother me. I don't know why he felt the need to tell me that, but it doesn't bother me. What a jerk, though. But yeah, I did all sorts of. I was trying to come up with a very clever cover, and I couldn't crack the case on it. And so I ended up doing a redo of Nick McMahon's famous cover of Dredd sitting on top of the word crime or whatever it is with a big. What is it? Spud gun? What's the big weird rifle thing called?
I don't know. Lawgiver?
Law rod.
Yeah. I think so. The big one.
It sounds weird to say out loud.
Whatever it's called. So I just swapped out 2000 for crime and called it a day. But tried to mix anatomy is so exaggerated and weird that when I tried to recreate the pose with my more realistic or standard or whatever style, it doesn't work if you try to give him real bones and stuff. So I had to tone it down to make it work, which was kind of a weird puzzle to do. But hey, look at that!
Oh! There he is.
Sorry, that's it. Yes, I've been looking it up on Barney. There you go. It's a great cover.
It is a great cover.
Thank you.
Love that cover. Yeah.
But yeah, one of my greatest honors in comics was getting to draw that thing. Very, very strange. Yeah, very, very few Americans get to draw these, covers at all, and to do the big, 2000 one is crazy.
Yeah. Well, is it different working on a cover for 2000 AD versus working on an American comic, or is it just, a cover is a cover?
It's basically the only weird thing is that it's magazine dimensions rather than comic book dimensions. It's just little squatter. So I mean, it's basically just you cut an inch off the bottom of the paper or whatever. But it's basically, I mean, draw a picture of a scary looking guy with a gun. Like, it's basically the same job.
Yeah. Well, it's actually funny you bring up Quietly, because I feel like, as somebody, you've both worked a lot with Grant Morrison.
Mm-hmm.
And, Morrison's one of those people who, like, the early wave of people who got their start on 2000 AD as well. And I was just wondering if that's, do you feel like that has sort of seeped into your work at all, just over the years of working with someone who comes from that background?
Probably. I think it comes in from all directions, and I think we've kind of gravitated together because we've got a similar sensibility. I guess. I mean, I'm a big. Vin and I are both Mobius fans, and so I was trying to do a Mobius thing for quite a while, and then when I got the Batman gig, I was like, oh. I just found myself looking at someone. Vin is Frank Whiteley's real name. I was just looking at so much at his stuff to just get the costumes right. And it just since he's such a Mobius guy, my style just kind of like very easily soaked up to Quietly influenced. So I kind of became an avatar of his or whatever for a couple of years. I think I've broken free of it a little bit. But then I mean, I've also read every comic Grant's ever written, so I just know exactly what they are going for. It's like I know what a good Grant comic looks like. I also very much know what a bad one looks like. I just want to draw the good ones.
It is funny you mentioned Mobius as well, because I was thinking about 2000 AD, especially in the early days, kind of in addition to its subject matter, made its mark by having these sort of more European style panel layouts, as well as this kind of traditional British and also American, like what we would be used to seeing. They had they played around with that a lot as well. But
I keep trying to do the weird British Frank Bellamy layouts with like the crazy panel shapes that don't make any sense. I cannot figure out how to do it. I love looking at it. Like I find it a challenge to read at first, but now I'm kind of in the zone, and I read my kids' Thunderbirds comics all the time. It's so strange, and I can't figure out how to do it because I recently did a battle story with Garth Ennis, and I was determined to really crack the case on how it works. I couldn't figure it out, so I just drew it the way I would normally do it. But I was looking at so much. It's Eric Bradbury's Crazy Keller. And I was just like, how does he do it? I couldn't figure it out. I read the entire, I read 200 pages of this to draw a 14-page story.
And it's like
use of my time.
12 panels to a page, and it's not even a grid. It's just like an assemblage of circles and squares and
I don't understand how they can get their heads around it. It's such a weird way of working, but I once you get the flavor for it, I think it's delicious.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Arthur, I was actually going to ask you, what is it like being a British person in America and working on Judge Dredd and also on 2000 AD generally?
I have not been back for since 2016, so
oof.
Yeah, it's quite a while. I guess I've gone native here a little. It's kind of interesting working on Dredd in particular, because that's the whole thing of Dredd is it's sort of set in America, but it's not really set in America. It's very much based on British things. So I kind of have to work with a sort of a mindset of I'm not going to, try and make this based on, anything that's particularly happening in America or, any sort of law enforcement subjects that are American based, which slides around a lot given some of the subjects are tackled. But it definitely is interesting that it's in this sort of floating, not quite America space, and you kind of have to maintain that. Then the movie stuff I worked on, I think I kind of collapsed that a lot more. That was more this is an interpretation of America in that one.
Mm-hmm.
I guess just because I had the chance to, yeah. I mean, I guess it's really, is it Johannesburg? I forget where they shot it.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
It was. Yeah.
With some CGI blocks in the background.
Yeah.
But
I love the look of the movie, how the blocks actually look like blocks. Like I think the city looks so much more oppressive when everything is straight up and down, and there's no goofy inviting curves. Like it looks much more horrible.
Yeah, they got a cool look. I mean, it's cool that it's kind of a distinct look.
I like
but yeah, in terms of like writing sensibility, I think there's definitely this sort of thing where you are shaped by what's come before. I don't know that moving away from the UK means that it's changed. I don't know where I'm going with that, Fred. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a big subscriber to this, like you have to be British to work on it.
Sure.
But there is kind of like a certain sensibility that comes with it, which is weird because as you guys pointed out, John Wagner is originally American, which I guess makes it a very transatlantic product.
Yeah. I mean, how do you sort of... Is there a way to sort of stop yourself from sliding over to, especially with writing about the policing aspect of Judge Dredd, which is a hot topic in both the UK and the US, also in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think because it has to be a little bit heightened and silly to be a 2000 AD. That kind of keeps it from sort of getting that extra level of specificity that would kind of make it too American. I don't know, I'm kind of rambling there a little. But it's certainly interesting also if you start writing about Britsit on top of Mega City 1, because Mega City 1 is America, but not really quite. It's more of a sort of parody of various aspects of British culture. And then you have Britsit, which is that squared. So I usually write those guys as just terrible.
How do you do Britsit? I mean, because I'm not as familiar with Britsit, but I never got the impression that it was as stupid.
Yeah, Britsit is weird because it's never been defined exactly what it is. Is it just London or is it all of Britain or whatever? It's kind of wishy-washy. But I think the best way to think of it is to pronounce it not as British, but as Brexit, because that's really what it's all about. Because they're separate from Europe for some reason that we don't understand. But yeah, I've written bits it a few times, and it's very hard not to write it as present day London, which I know quite well. And then you go, no, hang on, no, it's supposed to be set in the future. But when you do a good parody of London, it can be set at any time anyway. So it's very strange. Most of Dredd's world is, and I don't want to be disingenuous here, but it is kind of made up as you go along.
Sure.
We don't really know exactly how big Mega City 1 is, or where exactly Mega City 2 is, or how many different city-states there are in Asia, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of at the whim of the creators as we go. And every now and again, we do get some of the fans who will try and map this thing, and you kind of can't map it. It just doesn't really go. The important thing to remember, I think, is something that John Wagner said himself years ago. I can't remember what the context was, but someone was asking him a very complicated thing about one Dredd tale, whether he went, it's only a story. You tell us it's not the verisimilitude where you try to create something real. It is, each story exists to tell that story. And if you can build on something else, that's great. But you can't analyze it too deeply. It's like trying to analyze Star Trek. You just kind of keep finding plot holes and make you go, no, hang on, that doesn't work with this. But you have to, especially the beginning, the early days of 2000, you have to remember every issue was effectively disposable.
Right.
In that we didn't there wasn't the collection culture. There wasn't the culture then of always going back to what was there before. So when someone says, oh yeah, in what's Prague 30, suddenly Dredd was a 20-year veteran on the streets. And in any other context, that would have been thrown away. But because it's Judge Dredd, we now have to live with the fact that he was he graduated in 2079, which means that he's born around about 2066, which means we're catching up now to Dredd's birth. So, that kind of thing. We have to live with all these things. Where was I going with that? I don't know. But yeah,
I kind of like the sort of Al Ewing approach to continuity, which is basically it's all there, it's all valid, but only the bit of it that applies to what you're doing right now is in frame, so to speak. And that's a pretty healthy attitude. I mean, he's these days got the entirety of the Marvel universe to think about there, which is a bit bigger than anything you get with 2000 AD. But I think Dredd's universe is kind of getting up there as sort of one of the major shared fictional universes that has a bunch of people working on it.
I think certainly on this side of the Atlantic, it's the big one.
I mean, 2008 doesn't tend to have many of those. So like the Rogue Trooper kind of goes in for a bit of a shared universe thing. There's a bunch of stuff that's arguably part of the Dredd universe and then kind of buds off as its own thing, like Robo Hunter. I think when that started, there were like mega cities and there was a Brexit and people said Drock, but it sort of drifted apart into its own parallel thing that's something else.
The same with the ABC Warriors and Nemesis and all that. They're universes that are they're maybe shared, but the links are kind of tenuous.
Yeah. Well, I think Pat Mills does this a lot. Like, he will have characters from different universes, from different things that he writes in 2000 AD. They'll show up in different strips, or they'll reference, a character in one strip that he writes might reference a character from another one. Or it turns out, if they're set in different time periods, then one of them's actually related to or descended from somebody else. I mean, I think Garth Ennis does this as well, not on 2000 AD, but just with the comics he writes, he will do this with certain characters.
Did Helter Skelter as well, which was like entirely that.
Yeah. Have you read that?
Sorry?
It's just that everybody just shows up.
Yeah.
For reasons.
There's dimensions or something. Merge it together.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all the whole multiverse get out of jail free card everybody is playing these days, Well, they're doing it in Marvel and in DC at the same time. So I want to see them all cross over.
Well, do you find? Sorry,
we want to see the Little Mermaid crossing over with the Incredible Hulk and with the Little House on the Prairie and the $6 Million Man. I mean, I think we all want that.
I think they could do that now. I mean, I need to check the second the Little House on the Prairie and $6 Million Man. Like, who owns those properties? But they could definitely do The Little Mermaid and the Incredible Hulk now.
Absolutely, yeah.
When, Marvel? When? But this one is for everybody. I was wondering as well, with the way that sort of 2000 AD works and the way just comics work nowadays, how does that affect your approach with creating? Because, now everything is so much more global. 2000 AD is digital, so if you can get it from pretty much anywhere as long as you can access that. People are, I don't know if I'd say a lot more informed, but there are a lot more sources of information about what is happening around the world. Politics are, I think, more clearly globally intertwined. How does that affect what you all are doing?
I mean, probably.
Great. Moving on. No.
That's a loaded question. Well, it certainly has got loaded answers because when I started out writing, we didn't have, before 2008, there was no internet, so you had to look up things in books. And now there are no books; there's only an internet. We
just like Star Wars.
Yeah, well, we have this situation with the global world. Right, yeah. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a script called a series called Dreadnoughts, and for various reasons, it was delayed in coming out. And when it did finally come out, it was quite well received. But it always happened to land at the exact same time that America was pretty much disappearing up its own backside in terms of police corruption and chaos and war and the whole George Floyd thing and all that sort of stuff. And it was chaotic, and people saw an incredible amount of parallels between my story and what was happening in the real world. But I'd written it all long before that had broken. The police brutality and the heavy-handedness and the right-wing attitudes and all that sort of stuff. So the way it's always been is that readers will always find depth in a story that the writer doesn't necessarily intend. And it can be because of the current political climate, or just coincidence, or just because they're looking for meaning, which is often the case. So every writer's job, and I presume it also counts for artists as well, but every writer's job primarily is to just tell the story as best as they can and not try and, hammer a message in there. But real world stuff influences the readers outside of the comic, and then when they're reading the comic, that still lingers. Sometimes there are traces. A bit like if art in an elevator, you even after you're long gone, the next person is still going to go, something happened here. So with that, when people look at Judge Dredd and they go, oh my God, 2000 AD predicted the future, it's because they're looking for a match. If they look at all of the things that 2000 AD did, they go, yeah, 2000 AD predicts the future, much in the same way that a pigeon will pick a specific breadcrumb out of a pile. It's just chance. So it's a case of, I suppose, what would you call it? It's a bias that we have towards wanting to see patterns. So, sometimes, when we see, especially with the heavy-handed laws that happen in the States.
Certain kinds of patterns are going to match more often. I know I've kind of hit that twice, that I've had stories that have been sort of dealing with riots or, police brutality come out just as stuff was really kicking off. And, both times it's been kind of coincidence, but I guess it's not a coincidence that coincidence keeps happening. Never feels good.
Well, it's like they say with The Simpsons, they say, oh, The Simpsons predicted this and The Simpsons predicted that. Yeah. And somebody said, no, it's just that the problems haven't been fixed in over 30 years.
Exactly. The same thing crops up again, and people will see that as significant when really it's an outlier. But, that happens. But, you can steer that in a way. You can have a look at the news and go, well, what's likely to happen next? When's it likely to happen? And what story, if I write it now, will be coming out then? You can kind of do that to a degree. But, most science fiction gets 99.9% of it wrong. But people, when they see the 0.1% that gets correct, they go, Star Trek predicted such and such, or Star Wars predicted that.
Right.
But, it's just pattern matching that we're, or pattern seeking that we're good at.
Chris, as an artist,
I have nothing intelligent to say, yeah.
And as an American artist, what do you... Sorry, just asking it. I just never get to ask the questions in the way that I get asked stuff,
Oh, yeah. Yes. So, what's it like to be a white man in comics?
Yeah, what's it like to be an artist in comics? What is it like? What is that like from the artist end of things? Because we've heard from what it's like to write it, but when you actually have to draw it.
Thankfully, there's Google Images, so you can look up what things look like, which is helpful.
For Crazy Keller, all the weapons.
Man, yes. Garth sent so much reference over. So then it's like there's so many different variations on Sherman tanks or whatever. Just like, did you want this one or this one? And so many, a lot of these things have been continuously made for the last 60 years or whatever. It's like, is this Jeep right, or is this a version from the 70s? Like, it's, to me, they all look the same, but he can count the rivets or whatever. Thankfully, the only thing he busted my balls about was my Nazi helmets were starting to get a little, mushy looking, but he didn't make me redraw anything. I don't know. Sometimes you got to be more, we try to be more thoughtful than maybe we're in the past about, representations of things. It might have been you actually. I'm not sure. There was an issue of Batman Inc. where Talia's son, the Heretic, is getting like dressed up in his raiments or whatever, and I was just like, he's got some women in waiting or whatever who are dressing him. So I just made them look like like Tex Avery, like sexy Arabian ladies. I didn't think about it at all. It's just like that's who they'd be, and they're dressing him. And a couple people. If it wasn't you, it was that they were like mindless ones.
This one wasn't me. It was someone else who got mad on the internet.
I got pounced on.
Unusually.
Like, oh yeah. Fair enough. I mean, I it was 100% thoughtless. So just didn't think about it at all. It's like, oh, right. Fair enough. There's,
Yeah. But I also feel like, sorry.
No, but I mean, I do think it's weird that it's smelling the fart. Like I, as a kid who grew up in the 80s, watching cartoons that were made in the 40s by people who, grew up in the 20s or whatever. So that's literally, I'm still thinking about stuff that someone else, watched 100 years ago. So just how long, a dumb little notion can, live on in someone's head, before it gets, kicked out. So I think that sort of thing is interesting.
Well, what about, with art, have you ever drawn anything where people go, oh, that's just like the thing, or, it looks uncannily like
thing I'm intentionally copying. Yeah, I don't think I really get the that's so prescient sort of thing. That sort of thing doesn't happen to me. Although there's the Nameless uses a lot of Elon Musk is kind of a character in Nameless, and so they're like the main Darius Dax or whatever. That's not his name. I can't remember what his name was. Is very much Elon Musk's scalp on Richard Branson's face. I just Muddy Monster Maker on him or whatever. And so that has kind of he bought a moon base and they're quarantining. And so that has, proven to be, not so much present, but it just kind of rhymes with realities. It's that's kind of weird, but it wasn't my fundamental idea. So people post it all the time. It's I certainly drew that, but
I think that's a really good way to put it, actually, that it rhymes with reality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Versus trying to shoot for a specific echo or a specific,
right.
Oh yeah, it's exactly like this thing.
I'm writing this down. Rhymes with reality.
Yeah, that's really good.
I am so stealing that. I think I probably thought of that first, just didn't tell anybody. I'm pretty sure I did. Yeah, but that's how I remember it.
Well, that could. I was going to say that could be the tagline for this. It was going to be 2000 AD, 45th, like a fart in an elevator.
Oh, don't do that. Well, yeah, rhyming with reality or something. That's pretty cool, actually. Yeah.
But
can I ask Chris a question?
Yeah.
All right.
You guys
Chris,
go for it.
Chris, if you were you're fairly familiar with most 2000 AD. I know you said you only got some of the back issues, but is there any character from beyond Dredd from 2000 AD's history that you feel really drawn to that you'd like to work on?
My favorite Dredd story is the one with the blobs, but Matt Smith already wrote me something with the blobs because I asked for it specifically.
Yeah. But outside of Dredd, though, what about something like Strontium Dog or?
I love Strontium Dog. It's a bummer that he hasn't appeared since Carlos died. Right? Is that true?
No.
Well, it's been a few.
There was a recent thing, but it's not.
Yeah, we did a sort of young Johnny Alpha story, but we haven't carried on the main storyline as such.
Yeah. I love Strontium Dog. What a fun outfit. I love the. I'm very bummed out when they reveal that he and Wolf are not gay. What a waste!
I know.
What a waste to make them not a couple, because they so clearly are. And it's oh no, he's laying pipe all over the galaxy. What are you talking about, man?
That does not exclude anything.
Yeah, I was going to say that does not make him gay.
Fair enough. You're right. Fair enough.
But yeah, he's laying pipe, but only with the hot alien ladies.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Sure.
You saved me. Thanks.
Garrick in Star Trek. Also a waste.
Oh man.
Yeah.
This is apropos of nothing, but I saw a video of Zelensky just like strutting through a lobby the other day, and I was like, that guy looks just like Captain Kirk, just like he's got a real Captain Kirk swagger to him.
Yeah.
That means nothing to no one, but it struck me.
Hopefully he is more responsible as a leader.
Right.
But yes, this could be the official appeal. 2000 AD, let Chris Burnham draw gay Johnny Alpha.
Yes.
Big gay Johnny Alpha. Yes, please.
I'm into it. Yes. I'm giving ideas away. I want Henry Flint to draw a big crossover with everyone in it. Like do the whole Pat Mills verse with like the Nemesis and ABC Warriors. I want Slain in there too. I want everyone fighting one of those different time traveling dinosaurs all across the universe.
Oh, Henry Flint Nemesis would be really good.
He did it already, right? I mean, he
did like a Nemesis that went from, I want to say, a end of a Kevin O'Neill run right up to Kevin O'Neill doing the final Nemesis.
Right. Yeah.
How did my brain just? Yeah.
That's a good one. And bring back Shakara too. Get Shakara in there. God damn it.
Yeah.
But who will draw all of that?
I want
Chris.
No. I want nothing to do with it. I just want to read it.
Oh. I meant to ask you this earlier, but like, so as an American, I'm going to keep bringing this up. But what is it like, reading Judge Dredd, this British comic that's sort of about America, but not really, and it's not even, it's about this sort of exaggerated version of America that's actually Britain.
Yeah. The thing that I find the most incongruous is the lack of definite articles. So like Dredd works for Justice Department, but in America, he would work for the Justice Department. And so there's all sorts of weird little things like that I kind of drive me a little crazy. I mean, obviously it could not be less important, but like it's all I can notice.
That's a really good, that is true. I never sort of picked that up, but now that you've mentioned it, I'm like, I always say, he works for the Justice Department, but if you see it written down, I think maybe now they've started putting it in, but certainly in the early days, I don't think they did.
It's crazy future lingo where they're just shortening everything.
Well, that's what people talk over here.
Yeah. There's a couple weird Britishisms that totally spoiled a couple stories. There was I think it was a Rob Williams one where it's like the end of it is the Mega City one gets like covered with ice or something, and like the end punchline was something like, "Oh, we've got to get grit on it" or something. And I was like, "What does that mean?" And what is grit the sort of like rock salt you use to melt ice or something? Yeah, like it just went. It did not understand what the hell he's talking
See,
about.
I'm probably now screwing that up the other way and introducing American stuff that nobody knows what the fuck it is to Dredd stories. And I blew the PG.
that is something that I struggle with, as an Irish writer, trying not to use Irish phrases that wouldn't crop up. For a great example, when I'm teaching classes, I always say to the kids, the students, we have this Irish thing of saying, well, I was just after coming home and I was just after going to the shops, which means that I had just gone to the shop, or I had just come home. But we say just after, I don't know why. And I had to censor that in a story that I was editing for someone else. And an Irish writer who absolutely insisted that, no, they say that all over the world. They do not know what that is. But that happens a lot. Actually, it's strange enough, the writer in that case was American-born but living in the UK actually at the time. But it happens. It happens a lot when I read a Stephen King book or something, and they say, well, the murder happened at 4:15, and I'm going, is that 4:15? Is that like 3:45? What does that mean? And then they say, well, I don't know. I was grading on a curve, and we go, what? We don't know what that is. And then they go, touchdown. And we go, what? So, yeah, we're not at a loss. We're just making this stuff up as we go along, you know.
So is that something that we those of us on or from different sides of the Atlantic, just we need to suck it up because America's been doing it for so long?
Yeah, we have to. Yeah, we have to try and absorb the other cultural idioms in such a way that we can fake using them. And most of my books and stories tend to be set in the States. So I've been faking it for 30 years.
Yeah.
But it is so strange sometimes when you look at a phrase and you go, yeah, we wouldn't say that. Mm-hmm. But then of course we don't say things like I could care less. Over here, we say I couldn't care less because that's actually literally what it means. People say I could care less.
That drives me crazy too.
It only works as irony. It doesn't work as a literal phrase. Yeah.
Well, that's funny that you associate that with American. I just associate. I say it could not care less as well, but I feel like the other way is rising up. Trust me.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know if I could even.
I Joyce all the Irishisms.
Yeah.
Well, we
one guy.
At all. We should have known better because that's a good one. But yeah, we have to watch these things when we're writing. If I'm trying to write Dredd's dialogue, I have to be very careful not to use anything that's actually not really Judge Dredd himself, because the way I found the best way to write Judge Dredd is to give him as little dialogue as possible and let his fists and go and do the talking. So you get the other characters to talk, around Dredd, but it's very important to keep that sense of at least a touch of credibility within the thing. It's you don't have to be 100% real, but you have to be quite close to it.
I mean, like Mega City Citizens, they can totally just be a bunch of British archetypes and it just flows. No one bats an eyelid.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question, actually. Like, I mean, if Mike Welcher were here, he'd be able to answer this better, but I'm just curious, given that 2000 AD has, I think much more of a global audience now than it did certainly in its early days. How British are you or Irish or whatever are you like allowed to be before people start getting confused?
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, I've never had anything rejected on those grounds. Only on grounds of quality. So lucky me, eh? But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose if we wrote a story that had tons of references to something that only exists within one particular clime, for example, if we had Judge Dredd's characters talking about Crossroads, which was a British sitcom, or British soap opera that's long gone now in the States, something of that nature, then it would obviously be resoundingly and immediately rejected with good reason. But yeah, I don't think it's that much of a problem. One of the things is that by the time you're allowed to write Judge Dredd, and Arthur will know this too, we'll have read and written an awful lot of other things. So we're familiar with what's available.
I will say, John Wagner, like through the early years of Dredd, there are a ton of incredibly obscure British 70s and 80s cultural references, not just in block names, but like in all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I don't think it's ever been an issue.
Yeah, I mean,
it just kind of exists as its own weird thing.
Yeah, exactly. Did you find this having to Google things?
The weird thing for me now is I think I'd actually have a lot of trouble writing a contemporary British thing. I'm kind of coming at it the other angle now. If I was writing something set in the UK, I'd have to find some reason to set it in the 2000s or the 90s.
When you were there, yes. Yeah. That's a point. Yeah, but of course, everything because we're writing in a heightened reality, the idea of the future or a future, not necessarily the actual future, then we are allowed to get away with things that we wouldn't otherwise. So I've had a case many, many years ago where I was writing a script that was set in Chicago, and the artist drew this office scene, but he had, there's a tiny thing, the plugs on the walls, the sockets on the wall, the power sockets, were standard British/Irish power sockets with the 3 pins.
Oh, no.
And I had to catch him up, but I said, no, hang on a minute, you can't do that. And he went, oh. And he suddenly realized what he was. And then occasionally we have to do things like tell the artist, okay, the driver is driving along, the passenger is next to him. The passenger is going to be on the driver's right, on the right side of the car, not on the left side of the car. And if it's a British artist or an Irish artist, they might not think of that, or Australian, they might not think of that because what for them as the norm is suddenly reversed. So yeah, that's one reason judges have motorbikes. There's no left and right side of the motorbike. Oh yes.
That's funny.
Yeah, now I'm going to go back and look at, in Judge Dredd, when they depict the expressways and things, I'm going to look at what side of the road everybody drives on, or if they're all just going one way.
Well, sometimes it's easier just to have a one-way street, just because that way the artist.
I think a lot of it is just one way, because otherwise it just gets too much.
Yeah.
Well, it is kind of nice to know that these things still happen in a way. Like there are legends of, in the early days of 2000 AD, this is when they were using a lot of artists from like Spain or from Argentina or that part of the world, and everything was via post, and the ones I remember are, there was an instruction to the artist, like, oh, there's this crowd, there's a guy with an artificial arm, and he's waving with the arm. Oh, Garth has disappeared. But they meant just, he's got two arms and one of them's artificial and he's waving.
Yeah.
And then the artistry was a guy with two regular arms. Yeah. And then he's holding an artificial arm and he's waving it around. And
that's so 2008. That's awesome.
And there's another one.
Way better that way.
Yeah, right? The Outriders story, which is this might be a Judge Dredd one. It's supposed to be, the character is here, they're flanked by some Outriders. And what the writer meant was people on motorcycles and stuff. Yeah. But the artist didn't know that. So they drew a bunch of people on horses.
Oh, very good.
And then they had to go back and do it again. So.
Oh man.
Yeah. But it's nice.
Those horses robots, man.
Yeah.
Just make them a little shiny, call it a day.
Exactly. Or just draw some rivets and.
Hey, back.
Yeah, but it's kind of gratifying to know that, as much access as we have to information, to all these other countries and different cultures, that people are still doing that. It's very gratifying.
The gap between different people's cultures because of languages it can be awkward, but it can be a great source of entertainment and misunderstandings is what fiction is all about. Every kind of fiction. Disagreements and misunderstandings. So when you have something like that, I mean, some of the great language in 2000 comes from, supposedly, from Jerry Finlay Day, who created Rogue Trooper, among other things, from his atrocious typing. He would just bash out the scripts, and sometimes the keys would be the right ones, and sometimes they weren't. And so the word skrotnik, which, as we all know from 2000, means excellent or very, very good, comes from the word escorting. So he apparently typed in a script where these characters were, escorting across the plains or something like that. And they're all looking at this word skrotnik going, we don't know what this is, but those words get picked up, and that's kind of, it adds to the rich culture we have in 2008. I mean, 45 years of this stuff. I mean, that's longer than 4 decades.
Yeah.
It's amazing, It's a huge amount of time. I mean, if 45 years, I mean, if you ate cake every day for 45 years, you'd be dead.
Yeah, so that's just amazing. Die.
Think about it.
Oh, I think that's a pretty good note to wrap things up on. But before we
cake, yes,
don't eat too much cake or you'll die. That's it. Read 2000 AD instead. There you go. Well, thank you all for coming to this panel. It was so lovely to talk to you all today. And before
what have we got coming up soon?
Yeah, before we head off, what has everybody got that they want to plug?
Go Beans.
I should be in this week's 2000 AD with a new series of Intestinauts with Piper. So that's it's going to be fun for everyone.
It's a fantastic strip. Chris, what have you got?
At some point this year, I'm not sure exactly when it comes out. I'm in the Garth Ennis Battle Action Annual or hardcover, whatever it is. So I've got 13, 14 pages of Crazy Keller in there. There's a new Kevin O'Neill story in there too, but that's the real reason to buy this thing.
Yeah, look forward to that. I've got some more 2000 stuff coming up. The Protest X graphic novel is coming soon, next month, April. That's the first 2 books together, and just about to start writing book 4, so that's coming up.
Really enjoying that one.
Oh, thank you. It's mad fun. What about you, Kelly? What are you up to?
Things. I don't know why I said it like that. I'm not hiding anything.
Sure.
Yeah, that's how you know I'm not. No, I write about comics and pop culture on Patreon at Until the End of the World. That's just patreon.com/Until the End of the World. And I am on Twitter doing bad tweets at Kelly Kanayama. It's just my name. So I take it. Oh, I should actually ask all of you, are you on social media where people can find you? I know you are, but
yeah, I'm pretty much on Twitter under my own name, so I'm easily found.
Okay. Chris?
I am the Burnham on Twitter is where I waste most of my time, and then I'm on Instagram as well, but most of the stuff that's there is on Twitter first.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and my blog, Rusty Staples, which is all about comics. So yeah, and I've got my own website and lots of things like that. So I'm quite well versed in wasting my time on
And that's why we're all here today. Yay! Well, thanks, and stick around to see the rest of the panels. Bye.
Thank you.